my pleasure to be introducing the next couple of speakers. We have three speakers and 2 talks in the next session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laurel Bestock. I'm an Egyptian archaeologist here at Brown. Egypt is technically part of North Africa, although not really the same field as much of what we're considering today. Our first talk today, you can see, will be jointly delivered by Jen Gates-Foster and Elizabeth Murphy. Jen is an assistant professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Elizabeth Murphy, we sadly had to let her go recently. She is a recent Brown graduate who is now at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU in New York. They will be speaking to us today about the ceramic production in North Africa, outsider perspectives, and comparative looks. Take it away, guys.
So let me see if I can do this correctly. So I think that I can speak for both Jen and myself. When we first were asked to participate in this workshop today, we each had a similar response, and that was essentially, Sue, you do know that we don't work in North Africa. So as a disclaimer, I should just say that right from the beginning. And probably far more reasonable people probably would have just respectfully declined. But I know myself and Jen, both of us have done work with Roman and late antique tablewares. And by necessity, that has required following the study of African red slip ware. ARS is ubiquitous in the ceremological literature on the period, with detailed studies of typology and decorative treatments, archaeological surveys to identify the locations of production sites, archaeometric analyses to characterize ware groups. And the scale of academic interest in this tableware is perhaps reflective of the scale and extent of its ancient distribution, as well as its influence on tableware styles for the period more generally. The importance of ARS to social and economic studies of antiquity is undeniable. And in this segment of the presentation, I'll focus on 2 very current themes of ARS studies that have parallels at the Tableware Production Center where I've been working in Turkey, far off in Turkey, but in order to underscore a few wider points concerning workshop economies of the period and to highlight how research conducted on the other side of the Mediterranean might offer some speculation, and I emphasize speculation, on ARS and its production. The first branch of research concerns late antique consumer styles. More specifically, tablewares of the late antique period have attracted much attention concerning changes in vessel shape and size related to changing dining practices, as represented by shifting preferences from small cups and bowls to larger bowls and platters, i.e. individual portions to shared dishes. Central to these studies has been the evaluation of ARS, one of the most ubiquitous tablewares in late antiquity, but such trends are certainly not exclusive to that industry, as demonstrated on the slide by Sagalassos red slip ware assemblages and their different sizes through time. A second branch of research concerns production technologies. Although very few ARS workshop sites have been systematically excavated, significant interest has nonetheless been placed on the technologies used in its production, particularly concerning the identification of saggers used during kiln firing. These saggers comprise cylinder-shaped ceramics that could be placed one on top of another and were used to protect stacks of tablewares from the smoke and flames of the fire. A technological relationship with these protective vessels has been proposed with tubular kilns associated with early imperial terra sigillata centers in Italy, Gaul, Germany, and Britain, and which are said to represent a sort of inverse furnace design to the later cassettes. It is at this point that we'll turn to my work at Sagalassos in southwest Turkey on the production of another type of tableware, that designated Sagalassos red slipware. In the process of tracking production traditions within the industry over its 7 centuries of activity, some observations were made concerning the impact that preferences for larger vessel forms, coupled with technological innovations, particularly that of sagger use, seem to have had on workshop economics. These results from Sagalassos may have food for thought for the organization and economics of ARS production. So in a recent study at Sagalassos, I analyzed 2 production waste dumps, and it's always ugly, cruddy looking stuff, but these are 2 production waste dumps from the eastern suburbium of the city, dated roughly to the 2nd and 6th centuries each. These deposits presented certain material types, misfired wasters, kiln furnitures, etc., which enabled a reconstruction of manufacturing techniques for each period. Generally speaking, several differences were observed between the 2 periods, and some of which have parallels with technical changes in ARS, such as the transition in relief wares from the use of appliques to stamp and molded wares. But of more interest for our purposes today is what the material showed concerning kiln stacking procedures, most notably a change from free stacking in the kiln using only small kiln furniture, spacers, wedges, pads, to the use of large straight-walled container forms to hold stacks of tableware. As the use of saggers in Roman red slipware production has been identified until now primarily at North African production sites, this assertion, of course, requires some substantiation, which I'll quickly move through for the sake of time. And this evidence includes things like patterns of extreme and unusual overfiring, discolorations on the bases, and actually an example in which a stack of bowls is fused to the inside of one of these containers. There's additional changes in kiln furniture, which seem to represent, to correspond to these shifts. And finally, the distribution and range of diameter measurements suggest that the tableware vessels were purposely sized to fit into the container forms in the kilns. So having presented some of this evidence for sagger use, at this point I need to be very clear that I don't see these containers as direct matches with the ARS cassettes. First, they're not nearly as specialized in their function. The ARS cassettes lack a base, making them kind of used for other purposes, while the Sagalassos containers appear to have been slightly more multifunctional in industrial uses and were filled in conjunction with the fineware lacane forms, which are these straight-walled vessels in the red slipware. It is currently unclear to what extent, if at all, the stacking techniques from Sagalassos may be related to North African traditions, or whether they may form part of a wider technological trend at production centers during the period, about which, frankly, we know so little from other red slipware production sites. It nonetheless raises questions regarding the scale and extent of technological shifts in ceramic production from the Roman to late antique periods, which should perhaps also consider other contexts of industrial ceramic saggers, about which also we know very little in many cases, which include not only that of Egyptian faience production, which Bonafé had first proposed, but also with lead glazed wares or even crucibles, basins, or molds from other industrial settings. Such discussion based on current evidence certainly won't be resolved here, nor is that really my primary concern in talking about this. Rather, my intention in presenting this evidence concerns a larger issue related to the impact that these technical changes, coupled with typological preferences for the larger vessels, might have had on late antique workshop economics, and these variables apply to both Sagalassos and North African production sites. So in order to investigate this, the least exciting video game ever was created called Stack Your Own Roman Kiln, by which I was able to reconstruct kiln loads for the Imperial and late antique period assemblages at Sagalassos. I won't go into the minutiae of this reconstruction for the sake of time, but if anyone's interested afterwards, I'm happy to talk about it. And these two reconstructions resulted in some strikingly different figures, with kiln load estimates ranging between 1,500 to 2,000 vessels for 2nd century material and 350 to 400 vessels for the 6th century material. Thus, within this 1.1 meter cubed kiln space, there's over 4 times as many of the smaller, earlier vessels stacked per firing. Regardless of any ancient tricks of the trade, which a modern reconstruction inevitably would have missed, this figure does generally allude to differing scales of kiln output, and therefore highlights what was presumably a major change in workshop economics over the many centuries of production at the site, especially given that fuel and labor associated with kiln firing is normally considered the most expensive cost of the production cycle. So you can imagine how this might trickle down into the fuel and labor cost per vessel being fired. Not to mention the implications that this would have had regarding the rhythms and rates of kiln firing, the number of kilns per workshop, etc. These observations on the Sagalassos material have several implications on how we reconstruct workshop economics and production organization at the North African production sites as well. First, the study demonstrates the intertwined nature of consumer styles and production technologies and their potentially significant impact on the organization and costs of making pottery. Second, it offers some caution when applying models of production organization and workshop economics derived from earlier terra sigillata production sites, particularly those from South Gaul and Italy. The second point is of particular concern because these estimates from late antique saga are not so very far off from those made from other sites. For instance, if we compare kiln estimates made by Bonafé for kiln 1 at Ounda, North Africa, with the recent reevaluation of the first phase of the Grand Fort La Grafasson in southern Gaul, it's an earlier production site, it suggests that even more pronounced differences than those observed within the industry at Sagalassos, and after tempting hints that perhaps such shifts in workshop economics may have been more widespread. Obviously, however, tons more work needs to be performed on these themes before we can really speculate further, and I've probably already gone too far. But this analysis simply offers some provocative thoughts on the issue. To quickly conclude on my part, probably too long anyways, but this research performed on material from Sagalassos clearly relies on the specificities of the production at that site. However, some of the results of these analyses are presenting new sets of questions about the relationship between consumer styles, technological innovations, and workshop economics that can be used to promote new ideas on the study of Roman and late antique tableware production. Thank you very much. And now on to Jen, who will give the second half of Outsider Perspectives.
Part 2. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Okay, so like Elizabeth has already said, neither of us is a specialist in the archaeology of North Africa, so it's a bit of a privilege and very intimidating to offer something like future directions in the study of ceramics, since my perspective, of course, is necessarily that of an outsider. And as Laurel's already alluded to, that's unless you allow Egypt a seat at the table. Indeed, I understand that Egypt remains a bit of a world apart in certain ways, although I understand you'll be revising that view next year when you do your state of the field for Egypt. But in one respect, and indeed in others, I imagine, Egypt is very much integrated into the material world of North Africa, and that's in its entanglement with the ceramic products of coastal North Africa, especially ARS. Elizabeth has already pointed out that ARS is a touchstone in the late Roman period with its voluminous, enduring, and influential presence across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. So in the few minutes that I have today to supplement what she's already outlined with regard to studies of production of ARS and the cognate work that she's doing in Asia Minor, I want to offer some thoughts on the current state of scholarship on the consumption side of the equation of ARS in the wider Mediterranean, particularly in Egypt, which is my own particular area of research, and on the implications that the shift to production studies, of which Elizabeth's work is such an important contribution, the effect that that has had in our overall understanding of ARS as a chronological and social marker broadly in the Mediterranean. So what are the effects of this pivot to production, and what has that looked like in terms of the research on Roman tablewares? John Hayes' fundamental work on ARS and its chronology was drawn implicitly from the consumption patterns he observed in his work at sites across the Mediterranean, where African red slip was found in quantity. And when late Roman pottery, which I'm sure you've all perused many, many times and read very closely in your deep thoughts about Roman pottery that none of you have. I'm kidding, most of you have, Lisa in the very front. I know you all love it so. It was first published in 1972. Very few production sites had at that point really been excavated and looked at very carefully. And as a result, later work, more recent work by Bonifay and others, who had the benefit of this much more detailed understanding of the regional production patterns in Tunisia, has significantly revised many of these, the dates of some of these key forms of ARS, particularly between the 4th and 7th centuries. And indeed, some of the most exciting work in recent years has focused on the production contexts of ARS along the coastal and interior zones of Africa Proconsularis. So this move to study production sites has also yielded a much more concrete understanding of the quantities, as Elizabeth again has very neatly shown us with that fantastic video game that I would absolutely play. That more concrete understanding of the quantities produced in these regional workshops has given us a much more substantial awareness of the scale and nature of the industry in its heartland in North Africa. So this has gone hand in hand with a renewed focus on the quantification and description of Roman economic structures, for which fineware pottery has been understood to be a key indicator. So all this is to say that the emphasis on the analysis of Roman finewares has overall, in some respects, shifted away from the somewhat impressionistic consumer perspective towards an approach that rewards full quantification and closer study of fabric as a way of assessing these larger patterns of production and distribution of ARS. This approach has in turn driven a much more numerically numerically focused approach to the analysis of consumption. And I'm thinking there of Ted Peña's work at the Palatine and Archer Martin's work in Ostia. They're both wonderful examples of this trend of assessing consumption of ARS through strict regimes of quantification. And both of these studies, among many others, of course, are revealing new ways that the consumption of ARS in Italy, for example, fluctuated over time, and the range of production centers involved in supplying the appetite for fine wares alongside other freight, especially wine and other amphora-borne commodities. It's important, however, even in the midst of this pivot to the countable and the concrete that has really dominated Roman pottery studies in general, not just of ARS, to continue to consider Roman fine wares, and in particular ARS, from the perspective of its social meaning. Our increasing ability to distinguish between regional products and to begin to imagine the quantities and even count them, which is amazing, and the production context of certain types makes this question of meaning beyond economy that much more acute. As pointed out recently by Poblome, Malfautina, and Lund, artisanal and production studies can make important contributions to the study of local communities, regional identity, and ethnicity, since the choices made by potters refract the dynamics of local networks of consumers as well as those further afield. These production processes can reasonably be assumed to be responding to the preferences of those groups as well as to those of the artisan and the particular process that they're engaged in of producing the works. So put it simply, what I would like us to also remember is this parallel strain of research that goes alongside these production studies, which seeks to address what it meant that ARS was so widely desired and was, alongside the other competing red wares, so commonly imitated. In the last year or so, I've begun to look at late Roman fine wares in the context of my own work in Upper Egypt and in the Golan foothills of Lebanon and Israel as not simply chronological markers, although of course they're enormously helpful in this respect, but also as part of a broader dialogue in the late antique period about the social currency of abundance. And that's what I'm giving you, just a sort of a money shot here of abundance, which is a key aspect of these late Roman wares. The massing of Roman red wares, including ARS and its imitators, especially Egyptian red slip A and B, in the households of 5th and 6th century Egypt, presents an opportunity to consider the way that value was communicated by repetition and the visual experience of plenty. Roman red wares are, by their very nature, profoundly imitative, and the vessel corpus is, over time, very conservative in certain ways, despite the already mentioned shift that Elizabeth has outlined to larger communal vessels in the late antique period. From the 4th century and following, the shapes and decorative schema of ARS changed in some profound ways, but given the multiplicity of production centers of ARS and its imitators, the variations that appear are in reality quite shockingly limited, particularly when compared with the production of mass-distributed commodities and other complex exchange systems of the ancient world. As is known by any pottery specialist charged with studying the pottery from a Roman site, the origins of particular vessels are often largely observable only through very detailed fabric characterizations, not through essential and immediately evident qualities of form or even decorative categories. So what are the implications of these observations for our understanding of the perspective of the ancient consumer towards ARS and Egyptian red slip as well? I'm myself exploring ways to assess and evaluate the experience that ancient consumers had with Roman red wares by considering the presence of large quantities of these wares in the environment of late antique households, and considering how the experience of abundance might have influenced the patterns of consumption that we can now begin to quantify and explore in the ancient evidence. The imitation of vessel forms in other media, including glass and metal, as well as the emulation of decoration borrowed from other ware types, is a related aspect of this work, and I'll hope it will yield new ways of mining this newly quantified data for observations related to the social meaning of the consumption and on the consumption of ARS in particular. So, in conclusion, for both of us, Elizabeth and I have tried, I think here, we hope anyway, to offer some thoughts that come from our perspective of comparative work with this material and the enormous appreciation we have for the significance of ARS in particular for the larger project of assessing Roman ceramic industries. It's telling, I think, and this was a point we discussed in preparing this, how much our own work in really quite far distant regions relies so profoundly and engages so closely with the ceramics produced in North Africa. As the study of these materials go, so goes, I think, in lots of ways, the entire field of Roman ceramics studies as a whole, making just how clear the particular questions that you're asking today about the state of the field in North Africa are, from our perspective, truly the state of our field. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
We will continue with our policy of saving questions for our discussion period at the end. It is my pleasure now to find the PowerPoint of and introduce Andrew Wilson, who comes to us from Oxford, where he splits his time between archaeology and classics. He has an extremely impressive resume, as I'm sure most of you all know, with interests in the Roman economy, ancient technology, water supply and usage, and Roman North Africa. He co-directs the Oxford Roman Economy Project and has served as the chairman of the Society for Libyan Studies and has excavated as far as Italy, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Cyprus, and Morocco, a list that does not include Egypt, but he is wearing an Egyptian tie.
Thank you, Laurel. And thank you, Sue, for the invitation to come and talk. Well, in fact, you asked me to come and talk about mapping coin hoards in North Africa. And the Coin Hoards of the Roman Empire project, which I co-direct with Chris Houdigo. What you didn't know at the time you asked me to do that was that we hadn't started looking at North Africa at that point. The project's been only been going 10 months, and so this is partly an illustration of, I hope, potential, but I hope we can point the way forward. The project is due really to this guy at the top right, Baron Lorne Thiessen, who funds the Oxford Roman Economy Project. And a couple of years ago he said to me, what we really need is a database of all Roman coin hoards ever. And I said, yeah, that'd be really great. It'd be a fantastic tool. We could do fantastic things. You know, we could look at coin circulation, we could map coins of different reigns, of different denominations, we could see where they go. Do you have any idea how much work this is going to be? He said, well, it might be a 20-year project. Yeah, it could be. So he's funding a 4-year phase one at the moment, in which we're simply scoping out the published hoards between Augustus and Theodosius, and trying to enter data into a database that will go online, that will contain information on hoard name, location, contextual information, where it was found, containers that it was found in. At the moment, basic information on the numbers and types of coin. We'll take a few of those hoards down to the individual coin record level, and the hope is that by the end of that phase one, we'll have a better idea of the scale of the problem. Nobody knows how many coin hoards have been found from the Roman world. We could be talking 15,000, we could be talking 30,000. And those hoards might range from a handful of coins to 270,000 coins. We started in January. My co-director, Chris Houdigo, is keeper of the Heberden Coin Room at the Ashmolean Museum. And we've appointed Philippa Walton, seen seated here, who's done most of the work for this presentation, as our main research officer. On the left, Jerome Myrat has written the database. He's also written the online databases for Roman provincial coinage online and the current project of Roman imperial coinage. He is both a numismatist, an ex-commodities trader, and a computer genius. So he's an extremely useful person to have. And then we've got various students involved. Pictured is Ben Hellings, but Ivan Honchev is working on coinage from Mysia, and one of my master's students, Amy Nizelek, will actually be taking the North African data that you'll be seeing and doing a thesis over the next 6 months of a more detailed analysis of coin circulation in North Africa. We are aiming to cover the empire and indeed ultimately regions beyond it, and to be able to map the distributions both spatially and chronologically of hoards, and to look at questions about hoarding, whether we can see relations between hoarding activity and invasions, crisis, or for example, whether if we see an increase in hoards at a particular period, is that actually due to a regular pattern of hoarding but an increase in non-recovery because, for example, this is a result of plague or something not like the usual crises we might tend to imagine. Obviously, we can't do all of this on our own, and all sorts of institutions, a number of which you see here, have been very eager to volunteer to collaborate and share data. In particular, we are working with the British Museum and Leicester's Hoarding in Iron Age and Roman Britain project. We gave them our database of the coin hoards we'd sucked into that from published material on Britain, and they're then enhancing that. They've added a lot more hoards. I should single out among these many collaborators, Bill Metcalf has been very generous in providing his data set of denarius hoards from Nero onwards, indeed at the level of the coin type. So actually we do have very detailed data for nearly a couple of hundred hoards that he's provided. This is a distribution map of the 2,300 hoards that we've got in so far. This is 10 months' work, which have spatial data. I should emphasize that this is basically, at the moment, a distribution map of the intensity of numismatic research, rather than a distribution map of coin hoards that actually existed or even were found. What it shows is that an enormous amount of numismatic work has been done for Britain. There's been a lot, indeed, in Gaul and the Rhine-Danube frontiers. Greece is largely blank simply because we haven't started on Greece yet, likewise Turkey and Egypt. Spain we are working on, but Italy looks remarkably blank, and that can't be anything like the actual picture. So this is very much a fact that there's a lot of published syntheses that were easy to capture data from for Britain, that Richard Hobbs has provided us with a data set covering much of Gaul and Germany, and Christian Gazdak has shared a lot of data relating to Romania. At the time I was asked to give this talk, we had precisely 0 hoards logged from North Africa, and we'd always thought that North Africa would actually be one of our biggest problems, because it is, although there's been a long history of archaeology in North Africa for some 150 years, it has to be said that I think the quality and quantity of numismatic studies on the region has lagged behind some other elements of the archaeology. There's been much less attention paid to that. And if you consider that North Africa is a region where the building inscriptions of all those monumental buildings from the usual suspects, which David Mattingly showed you, are abundant and frequently record prices, costs of buildings. This kind of map does not give a good reflection of the relative monetization of Britain versus North Africa, I think. However, while at the moment, and indeed for much of the foreseeable future, there may be problems in comparing, say, monetization or even hoarding in North Africa with Britain or another region. Within the region itself, we may be able to look at interesting trends and patterns, something I'll come back to. So far, we've got data in at the level of the hoard on coins and indeed objects found as part of mixed coin and object hoards, such as the late Roman hoard from Arras. And as I say, we'll take that down further to the coin level in the future. So over the last month or so, I did a bit of a bibliographic trawl, but a fairly rapid one, and then passed that information to Philippa, who's gone through a number of surveys, particularly an unpublished but on the web bibliography by Georges Heperot, and a useful article by Pierre Salamat on Sestertius hoards. We have not yet done a systematic trawl of the literature, but we have some 186 hoards logged so far, which break down by the modern countries, as you can see, 25 from Libya, 43 from Tunisia, 103 from Algeria, and just 15 from Morocco. The larger number from Algeria at the moment may simply be due to a bit of a longer history of French involvement there, and of course the fact it is a larger geographical area with more Roman sites in. For Morocco, we have just 15 hoards, but over half of those are 3rd century, and another 4 somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries, not clearly reported, and closing dates not very clear. We have considerably more information for Algeria, including a rather nice hoard from Ein El Janan, found inside an ostrich egg, 20 denarii, dating up to the reign of Commodus. Again, a sort of fairly notable increase in the number of hoards in the 3rd century, and fairly high numbers in the 4th and 5th centuries. The 1st to 3rd century, sorry, just to sort of talk about the map. I mean, the map gives an approximation of much of the main urbanized area, though not all of these hoards are found in urban sites, quite a number from rural sites too. And further work on the contextual data from those sites will be very interesting in enabling us to look at questions like the monetization of the countryside. We haven't yet embarked on. The 1st to 3rd century hoards, the vast majority of them are sestertii, and many of them contain only sestertii, and are mid to late 3rd century. We see a similar pattern to that in Spain. However, it should be noted that since at the moment we haven't done a systematic trawl of the literature, and we've just really taken the available summaries for the region, and one of those is actually Pierre Salamat's 2004 paper, which is actually entitled The Rarity of Sestertii Hoards in Africa Proconsularis, but is then a list of all the Sestertius hoards that he knows of. Nobody's done the same work for denarius hoards, for example, yet, and that will be one of our tasks. So that may well overinflate, overrepresent the Sestertius hoards against the true picture. The pattern changes in the late Roman period when we find that the hoards contain much more balanced, not entirely equal, but more equal numbers of radiates and nummi. But in fact, that the late Roman picture is heavily affected for Tunisia by a single very large radiate hoard from El Gem. If we turn now to Tunisia, we've got a much smaller number of hoards, only 43, less than half the amount from Algeria. Again, we see that while we've got only a handful of hoards closing in the late Republic or the 1st and 2nd centuries, there's significantly more known from the 3rd century, 7 from the early 3rd century and 8 from the late, and then a further 14 from the 4th century, 10 from the 5th. An enormous hoard was found at El Gem in 1973 with 41,339 radiates, of which some 4,000 have been catalogued by the time of their publication in 1976. And that massively skews the picture, as we'll see in a moment. The 1st to 3rd century hoards are dominated apparently by Republican denarii, but that's actually mainly from one single hoard. If you take that denarius hoard out, as you see on the right-hand side, then, as in Algeria, sestertii are the commonest coin type that we have. In the late period, the picture denominational breakdown is very much dominated by that big hoard of radiates from El Gem. So the pie chart on the left-hand side shows all hoards from Tunisia, including the El Gem hoards, and it looks like it's mainly radiates. Once you take that one hoard out, the picture is more than reversed. And it's mainly Numi. 25 hoards known from Libya, clustered in Tripolitania, and a couple in Cyrenaica. Again, some of these, quite a few of these, we know are actually from minor or rural sites, so it's not solely an urban phenomenon. And again, in fact, none in the first 2 centuries AD, a total of 5 in the 3rd century, and then suddenly 15 in the 4th century. That may well be consonant with the historical accounts of increased raiding and problems with the Austuriani in the 360s. Again, further work on the actual composition of those hoards would allow us to explore that further and see if we can refine the picture of instability from the 4th century onwards sketched by the texts. Again, in Libya, the early hoards are mainly sestertii, and the late hoards appear in the 4th and 5th century to be mainly dominated by Numi. That picture in the top right is again heavily affected by one single hoard, the Misurata hoard. But even when that's taken out, the overall late Roman picture is mainly Numi. Here is the Misurata hoard found in 1981 in a series of amphorae and pots at a small site at Souk el Kadim, 18 kilometres to the west of Misurata near Lepkas Magna. That hoard is still being studied. There's a very informative website, and that consisted of 108,000 Numi. They've cleaned 107,000 of them, and then they've left 1,000 that are in reasonably good condition, unclean, so that future researchers can compare their cleaning and so on. But they can still identify most of those. One question which arises is that Misurata hoard totally exceptional? Well, actually, the El Gem hoard had 41,000 coins in. This, what this is showing is that in some regions the overall picture may be heavily skewed by a single hoard, but it may be those big hoards that tell us something about the monetisation and the amounts of small change available. At the moment, the picture, as I said, is very much based on what published syntheses already exist. We have not yet gone through and systematically trawled all of the journal articles from the 1830s onwards, which at some point somebody's going to have to do. But what I hope the resource will allow us to do in the future is to play around with various questions. For example, in Pierre Salamar's article on the Sestertius hoards in Proconsularis, a lot of the mid-3rd century hoards he wants to associate with the revolt of 251. And that may be entirely possible, but I think what we would need to do is ask questions like, well, given that actually 251 is when the plague of Cyprian breaks out, and that rages for a good 10 to 15 years, is the pattern of hoards closing around 251 in North Africa markedly more than what we might see, say, in Gaul, away from the frontiers, where we might actually be able to explore the question of might there be a peak in unrecovered hoards in the mid-3rd century as a result of plague as opposed to military crisis. We will eventually be able to explore, when we've got things down to the coin level, questions of where do particular issues circulate empire-wide, and what variations can we see within regions. But as I say, at the moment this is more an illustration perhaps of the potential. We have only been going 10 months with one full-time researcher, and I think Philippa has done a fantastic job. So thank you.
Thank you so much for these stimulating talks. If you guys would come up as well so that we can open this up to questions. Let me turn on the light.
Two observations about the coins. One is that the pattern of the coin hoards in Africa, particularly Tunisia, mirrors, and even to some degree Algeria, mirrors the pattern of coin finds in both Canadian and Michigan excavations at Carthage. Predominance of 4th century material and 5th, even 5th century, just under and following 3rd, the 2nd smaller. Sestertii also suggests that what you have going on here is that as prices rise, the larger bronze sestertii become more predominant in the 2nd century, and that's a pattern that's echoed in Gaul, by the way. So some of the patterns you see in Africa are broadly similar to the ones we see in other parts in Gaul, for example.
Yes, and also Spain, which may say something about shared trends. And I think one of the key questions for Amy Nizelek, who's going to be looking at coin circulation in North Africa, will be to look at how the hoards compare with the well-published excavation finds from Carthage and a few other sites.
Have you thought of crowdsourcing?
Yes, we're kind of working towards potentially getting there. I mean, in a sense, we're doing a controlled version of that at the moment with the multiple project partners who are keen to work with us. There is going to be an issue of data quality and checking, but I think, I mean, at the moment, the database is not online. It's a standalone thing, and copies are given to partners who have a brief to work on a particular area. And then Jerome has a way of updating and synchronizing that. The next phase is to move to an online controlled phase where our project partners and we can all use the same database online. And at that point, we can think about what the technological problems of crowdsourcing extra data would be. In principle, the whole model could be extended to stray finds as well, which would just be logged as a hoard of one. And indeed, my student Ben Hellings, who's working on Belgium and neighbouring regions, is effectively doing that with the Fundmünzen series. We've been kindly given an entire set of the volumes for Germany, which we've chopped up and fed through a scanner, and Jerome is now creating routines to dump that into our database, and we can look at stray finds of those. But stray finds from elsewhere, without regions without a sort of organised catalogue like the Germans have developed, could be dealt with by crowdsourcing.
I actually had a question, and this comes from outside. I work in a largely non-monetary society, but about the behaviors behind hoarding in the first place, and whether or not we can really assume that the same things are going on, not just in terms of recovery, but I mean, is there singular or is there ever collective hoarding? For instance, 108,000 coins is an awful lot. Is there ever a deposit of coinage for a ritual purpose rather than
Certainly,
come back?
yes.
And how is
Yeah.
that going to affect our use of coin
Yeah.
hoards for understanding circulation and
Yeah,
economy?
and indeed, questions of patterns of hoarding and motives for hoardings are really at the heart of this. That's something that Philippa Walton has worked on already with her work on the Portable Antiquities Scheme in Britain, where she worked before joining us. And there clearly is a whole phenomenon of ritual deposition of coins, particularly one thinks of Coventine as well on Hadrian's Wall, which is full of 4th century minimissimi. So we can't assume that the same thing is going on in all cases, and to an extent, each case needs to be taken on its merits where contextual data are available. However, it may be that one can tease out larger patterns by looking at a combination of chronological and spatial effects. Because sometimes hoards are buried deliberately because there's a threat. People are trying to hide their money. Sometimes it may be that that is a regular pattern of storage, and the hoards that we've got are simply unrecovered storage that has not been recovered for reasons which may now elude us. Some of the very large hoards, it has been proposed, are pay chests and not a measure of individual wealth. So yeah, there's a whole set of motives that could be at play.
Just following up on that, this is utterly speculative, but is there any evidence that the Suq al-Khadim, the slave market, wasn't still a slave market in the Roman period, which would explain in part
I think, we know a little bit about the site. The hoard was found in modern agricultural works in the 1980s. I don't think that there's evidence that, it's not a major Roman urban site. It would be odd to imagine as a major slave market in the Roman period. So I think there probably isn't a continuity with the name there, but interesting thought.
I have a question for the gentleman. What would you like to see in North Africa? What is the thing that you're missing from the outside of this space?
Okay, well, one of the things that that dealing with North African products that are dispensed so broadly, the ARS is just one of a number of them, would be understanding some of the valencies of those products at home in a way that is, for me, not part of the production dialogue. So, because consumption is now, since that's what interests me, is it's framed now largely in terms of the artisan's process, and so looking at how they work in households near places of production is not generally, I mean, Bonifay's done a lot with this, but it isn't, it's done in a way that is so specific to the particular social situation of North Africa at various points that it is then hard to connect that to the patterns that we're observing in Egypt, which are related. And there's ARS all over Egypt, particularly in the north, and then ERS is responding to it. And so being able to tease out what ARS means in other places seems to me to require a much more kind of nuanced understanding of the way that it was received and used in social context in North Africa. And so that's something that I don't find a lot of sort of work on. So that's something that I would love if I had to make a request for a journal article on this particular, that would be a wonderful and I think really fruitful thing to have in hand, because we have it everywhere, and sort of understanding how it works at home would help us be able to contextualize its social functionality and valencies in other places as well. My answer to that.
I think that North Africa, like a lot of regions in the Roman world, still, there have been a couple workshop excavations performed. And certainly there's been a lot of interest about production itself. So there's surveys that have been put dots on maps, and there are kind of sketches of kilns. But the idea of the whole workshop itself and how it's organized, remarkably little is still understood about that. There's a lot of assumptions, and the last slide that I referenced was the assumptions about how these earlier massive major production sites in La Grafesson, Montans, all these other sites, oftentimes these associations, there's assumptions about the organization of North Africa being based on that, somehow that type of a model, and it's not necessarily the case. And we just simply don't have enough workshops that have been excavated and studied in the amount of detail that's necessary, I think, still to disentangle some of those questions.
So you would need new field work, but you might not.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah.
I'm just, just.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's true, actually, and I think that's one of the things, you asked us to think about heritage data and sort of what can be done with things that we already have in hand, and I think that is the sort of thing that could be done. And when I went digging for figures to try to reconstruct the tableware assemblage in Carthage or in some of the major ones, it was not, I mean, there were discussions about it, but they're old, they're quite old discussions before we have all this new work on redating and the production centers. And so I think what's happened, that's why I said this pivot to production has been so profound, and it's taken the whole scholarly sort of set of processes in African in fine life generally with it, has meant that we haven't then gone back to some of these same questions with the new data. And so that is hard to find. And so, yeah, you could definitely do this, I think, if they kept it. And that's something, not knowing enough about East African, some of these older, the sort of archived excavations, to go back and re-examine some of that would be really powerful. But again, I just don't know if it's possible.
I've got a couple of comments and a question. One comment, and be very afraid. Michel Bonifay, when I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, said, it's no good. We've got to tear up all the typologies, and we've got to go back to first principles with African red slip. And in particular, it's about putting fabrics and forms together. It was just what you were saying. So, the top expert is despairing at the sort of, and also his other point is, it's no good just studying the ARS, you've got to do the whole suite of pottery. So that was one comment. Second comment was about this shift from the individual portions, vessels can hold an individual portion, to communal dishes, and the implications of that, which I think are really profound. And we tend to think about Roman dining from the top-down perspective of people sitting on couches, but actually the communal dish is about the couscous culture, sitting on the ground with the vessel in between you, because otherwise sharing that food out of the dish is pretty difficult. And that has really profound implications. And I think that's one of the things that makes the ARS so interesting, and its invitations about dining habits for everyone, as opposed to the top levels in society. This is something really profound.
You could do it on a stibadi room.
Even then, I think there's it's not so. We can look at it from that elite view. But how many houses have permanent furniture in for eating meals. Think about the way this pottery is consumed right the way across society, and we find it in very small sites. And I think we need to kind of slightly rethink how people eat in the ancient world. And I think a lot of the time it's in rooms without a lot of fixed furniture, and these larger vessels are ideal for people sitting in groups on the ground.
And that was one thing that, that's why, my sort of take on this of thinking about abundance is how ubiquitous and available these sorts of things were. And so when you say thinking about particularly tablewares as an elite, is reflecting elite social customs and changes at that simple level, and clearly that's not what's happening. It is really pervasive as a set of things that people had in households. And so I started crunching some numbers, which I didn't really talk about a bit about, but in Egypt, there are places where the fine wares make up to 10% of the household deposits. I mean, these are big numbers, and I found similarly in Italy. I mean, it's really a lot. So these people have a lot of this, they have access to it, it's everywhere, it's not special. Yes, it is nice, but it is not special in the way that we tend to make it special. And so that kind of change, when it's observable, that sort of pervasive change it's going to change a lot of our ideas about the way the pottery can give us access to those kind of pervasive social changes.
In Zita, 50% of the tablewares were ARS. 50% of the ARS, and we're dealing 5th century here, were actually mortaria, were Hayes 91. Not particularly large, and I decided that it was for individual consumption of origin.
And there seem to be patterns like this where you get particular vessels. They're not near a production center, so you can't just say, oh, it's because they're making it nearby, and so that's why they end up with it. But there are these kind of clusters of different types that show up in really pronounced ways, and that's another example that I know about. And that's why I think imitation is a really interesting way to get at some of this too, is to see what it stimulates imitation and slight modification, but massive reproductions of other types that seem to relate to something special going on in a region or even a place at that level. And that's very interesting too, in the social meaning.
Just to follow up on your remark about how people have transferred models of production from La Grafosonka to African red slip and so on, I just wanted to ask the two of you what you thought the significance was of the fact that while ITS and Gaulish Samian ware tends to be stamped, African red slip isn't. I mean, what does that say about organisation of production? What can we conclude from that?
Yeah, well, this is an issue. I mean, this is an issue we also have in Turkey as well, because we don't have those same types of we don't have stamped really vessels. That tradition doesn't exist. That doesn't necessarily mean automatically then well, first off, there's a lot of debate about what the stamps actually mean in the first place anyways, even within the Italian and the Gaelic traditions. But I've also seen certain features on, I'll speak from Sagalossos just because that's the material that I'm familiar with. There are production markers, there's maker's marks, and they appear and you can see them. They're not stamps, but they are little incised lines. There are little markers that could be used in very similar ways as we associate the stamps being used as some sort of accounting practice, et cetera. In the late antique period, when you start to see these things, they're essentially seemingly making things to size so that they all fit in, and it looks like they're being made in batches. And so there's this, for example, an incised line technique in which they mark vessels, and we have that it gets put onto the vessels after forming, and then it makes its way all the way through the production process, and we have stacks of overfired vessels where the line runs all the way down. And it's clearly some sort of an accounting practice, some sort of batches of sets of things that are making their way through the workshop, but they're not as obvious as things like stamp marks. It's difficult to say about organization because there's a lot of different factors. Kiln size is only one aspect of this, but the rhythms and the organization of production within a workplace can be so multifaceted, and you can't really understand it fully by looking at a single element of the infrastructure. You have to understand how the clay processing, the storage of the vessels, and once you understand the entire production process within that workshop unit, you can tease out a little bit more, I think, about the types of issues that are really, really well studied at places like La Grafosonka.
Wonderful. Thank you for the stimulating discussion. Are there any further questions before we move to consuming things from vessels instead of discussing?
Steve Lubar. I'm at Brown University at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. The Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage Center overlaps with the Tchaikovsky Institute in the cultural heritage side of the world. And so Sue very kindly asked me to come by and introduce the session that talks about the current day in North Africa. As Will mentioned, we were talking earlier that there's a particular situation in North Africa right now. It's not just ancient world, it's also modern world. So the session this afternoon is North African archaeology and its broader communities. So we're moving out of archaeology and thinking about how archaeology divides in the world today. Two speakers, Will Raynolds is from NYU, who's been working in Libya, and Brett Kaufman is at the Tchaikovsky, working in Tunisia. So I won't give you the details of their biographies that's in the program. Let me introduce Will and Ryan.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you for having me here. I am somebody who have been involved with projects with a slightly different slant as compared to a number of the papers we've heard so far. And largely I've been involved with projects that are conservation projects trying to pass some site or group of objects through time. Although initially I was somebody who really liked to dig, and that's just an itch that I haven't been scratching very much recently. After the revolution in Egypt, after Mubarak stepped down from power, I found myself in Cairo, asking myself a number of questions that I think a lot of you working in North Africa have been asking yourselves, even if we haven't been overtly discussing them today. Questions about how will we continue, questions about how all of this political change is going to influence our work, questions about how we can continue that work, questions about whether or not we'll have funding enough or security enough to continue to ask and seek answers for all of these questions that we've been addressing so far. And I went to the tomb of Auguste Mariette in front of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo to kind of commune a little bit and look for some ways forward. And of course, right now, behind Auguste Mariette is the burnt out skeleton of the Hizb al-Watani building that was burned during the course of the revolution in Cairo. So a situation where, a day that Auguste himself would not have envisioned, and a time where, for all of us, since we must, and indeed our work is at the pleasure of the local governments, there's no way for us to escape this. This is our reality. The state of the field of North African archaeology is very much tied to the state of North Africa. So as I was there in the courtyard, I was actually thinking a lot about two guys in particular, Fawzi Araid and Munsaf bin Nasser, two men from the Libyan Department of Antiquities that I had recently been working with at Oberlin College. As part of the Oberlin mission to the Libyan Department of Antiquities, directed by Susan Kane and sponsored by the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation at the US Department of State. And Fawzi at that time was in Shahat, where really the revolution, the first violence of the revolution had started. Munsaf, who had been working with David in the field, was actually holed up in Ghadames at that point. But a few months prior to that, we had begun working together in the quaint and very idyllic grounds of Oberlin, although certainly by the account of these two Libyans, Oberlin was a frigid wasteland with not enough shawarma to go around. But we had been working in a slow way to start to increase the capacities of members of the department when it came to documenting and recording their archaeological sites. And that had started very simply. You can imagine, for the last 60 years, the department has been slowly gathering paper records related to a number of sites. It's divided into 6 different inspectorates. And the inspectorate of Shahat is actually where Susan had done some of her grad work and had remained in contact with these people through a lot of years where it was not possible to collaborate. So starting with the paper record, we made very basic progress in trying to digitize some of that, putting it into an Excel spreadsheet, getting some of these coordinates where we had them onto Google Earth. And, of course, as that was getting going, the revolution happened. And thank goodness, really all of our colleagues made it through. And even if they were far away from home, they managed to wait it out. And within 10 months of the start of the Libyan revolution, we had a chance to go back. So we went back to Shahat. This is Susan and her husband Sam, who have been instrumental in devising this project. And they were, of course, we were all very well received in those heady days after the revolution. And in this case, Susan was actually given an award by the community of Shahat and named an honorary martyr, which is the best kind of martyr to be. So we kept going with what we had planned, and Susan and Sam left me behind to conduct a training for the Inspectorate of Shahat, where we gathered a bunch of members of the department, archaeological researchers from around the eastern half of the country, and started to work on skills that maybe some of us, we've just been using them forever, but in the context of Libya that had been really cut off from this international discourse for a long time and had actually been cut off from a number of key ingredients and equipment. A lot of basic training, just using GPS, getting points onto the computer, a lot of typing skills and just computer interface stuff that we've been building up through time. And of course, the heart of these courses was a lot of time in the field, doing field survey in small areas to start to get the hang of a system. And we had, thank goodness, been offered the controlled vocabulary that the Getty Conservation Institute had developed as part of their Mega Jordan project, and now is known as Arches. But they had a whole list of vocabulary that we modified for the Libyan context from the Jordanian context, and went from the field into the lab, starting to build these small data sets. And in particular, we were always interested in trying to find places near where these trainings were happening, where we could actually get out there and record something that was changing, because our colleagues in the department in Libya, their task is to protect these sites, actually anything older than 100 years in Libya's case. So they need to know where those things are in order to protect them, and they also need to know how those things are changing, if there's any local threat. And in this case, these areas in red that you can see here on the coast near Villa Saline are archaeological sites that they identified, and those areas in blue are places where recent human activity, and this was back in 2012, where human activity had obviously changed the landscape and was in many cases threatening certain aspects of this archaeological site. So this became a popular activity. We found that the Libyan Department of Antiquities was eager to receive this kind of training, was eager to support us by paying for the food and lodging of the participants. And we did the first one in Shahat, which lasted about 8 weeks. We did another one in Leptis Magna, about the same amount of time. And then, based on the results of the exams that were administered during those trainings, we selected the best students. We brought them for advanced training in Tripoli. At which point, those students seemed to be competent enough that one of the municipalities in Yefren, in the Western Mountains, actually requested to the Department of Antiquities, well, send us all these people who have been getting trained, and we want them to train all of our local antiquities staff, and then we want them to train students and citizens, concerned citizens, in how to do this, because we're all willing to spend our own money on GPSs, and we're all willing to go out into the field and help with this survey. So that happened, and the community of Yefren paid for that course. And then, because that was pretty successful, a number of these students who had become sort of trainers in their own right went on to do copycat classes in Tokra and in Girza and in another one in Tripoli, just fleshing out the ranks of people who had these basic skills and could contribute to these field exercises. So very quickly we realized, whoa, we're getting into a data flow problem because there were a lot of people doing a lot of things in the field and not much infrastructure to bring this information together. So with our support and encouragement, and also with the gracious assistance of the department's headquarters in Tripoli in the Sarai al-Hamra, they gave us space and enabled us to create a data center where a computer lab could be established and where this data could come in from the field and live in a more permanent way. This is actually a pavilion that once served Gaddafi as a place to receive visiting dignitaries, and all of the windows have glass about this thick that's bulletproof. But if you open up the windows, there's nice cross ventilation, and it's a very fine place to work. And the center is now directed by Dr. Muftah al-Haddad, who is a previous student of David Mattingly. And he continues to oversee its operation, continues to invest in the capacities of the staff, and gradually migrating to more and more complicated platforms and using Esri programs, although we'd like to find and use open source solutions as much as possible. And also, most importantly, this center has a certain capacity to receive requests from field offices for pressing field survey, and then dispatch the right people in conjunction with local people to get these surveys done. And these surveys, there's been one in Zlitan and one in Alus and one in Nalut and another one in Girza. These surveys are also paid for by the local municipality in large part. We also, as the American Mission, do provide some assistance and support. But largely speaking, the local government is willing, once they hear that this is something that could happen, to pick up the bill for people's transportation and for their lodging and for their food. And the goal is, of course, not just to get information that lives in a database on a computer, but to find ways to share this information with the people who can use it most. And often right now in Libya, that's members of these local councils, local elected governments that have been elected all over the country. And once you have a map in front of you where you can see where the best archaeological resources that have been identified are, and where discussions about future plans for the city can occur. In this particular case, this guy over here, Khalid Masallati, is explaining this map of the Zlitan coast, his hometown, to the deputy mayor and the guys from the planning office. And the reason why he's doing that is because Zlitan hopes to build a new port, a huge project right on the coast. And it just so happens that the coast of Zlitan is one of the great and richest stretches of archaeological interest in Western Libya. So that discussion is very important. And was well received. I mean, to the extent that local governments can control what happens in their communities, which is not a given, it's a useful thing. Now, of course, in recent years, I have to be completely candid that there's been a lot of pressure on Libyan antiquities, and we'll just flash back a little bit just to give you some broader sense for it. But there were some 15 archaeological objects taken from the storerooms in Cyrene back in 1999, and these are just a handful of examples from different World Heritage sites around the country. Here, piece of a column snagged back in 2006 from Leptis Magna. Ongoing vandalism of the rock art sites in the Akakos. Illicit excavation in Sabrata back in 2010, and of course something that continues to occur. And of course, since the revolution, all of these general things that just happen, even in a time of what we would think of as autocratic, complete control of Gaddafi. These things happened then, they're continuing to happen now. It's intensified. So you've probably all heard about the Benghazi treasure that was taken from the central bank in Benghazi during the course of the revolution. These tombs, medieval tombs in Zuela, were destroyed about a year and a half ago. because they didn't represent the right way to honor Islam, according to the folks who destroyed it at least, but were locally significant tombs of that people continue to visit and mourn their loss. And of course, most recently, about a week ago, this sculpture of a woman and a gazelle in downtown Tripoli, which has long been, it was installed there during the Italian period, but it's long been seen as a symbol for the city. In 2012, it had already suffered a little bit of damage. Somebody stabbed her face. About a month and a half ago, somebody shot an RPG at her belly. And you know, somehow this is somewhat predictable in that, you know, here's this bare-breasted woman from the Italian, you know, colonial period sitting in downtown, but this sculpture has remained largely safe just because it occupies an important place in the public imagination of the city. And of course, you know, the local government asked the Department of Antiquities to take down the sculpture and you know, ostensibly for repair. But it was a little tricky just because the mandate, again, of the department is only things that are already over 100 years. The sculpture wasn't. There was some delay. And then last week, it got taken. And its whereabouts are unknown. So these events are happening, but really the main event, where are we really seeing change in Libya? That change is coming because there's a tremendous economic exuberance that's happening in Libya. People are deploying their savings, their private capital, to develop their own land and often to take land that had been in the public realm. So this is a stretch of coast not far from El Homs back in 2012. Here it is again in 2013. Here's some farmland outside of Benghazi. Here it is, you know, after the revolution. This is the area surrounding Villa Tajura back in March of 2013. Here it is again in May of 2013. So these changes are happening very quickly. And the reason why they're happening is not for iconoclastic reasons. It's not because people cannot bear to look at bare-breasted women, although that's happening sometimes. But most of it is happening because people are optimistic about the future. They're willing to spend their money to clear this land and have beach villas. And that, you know, they're doing that in places that were attractive, have been attractive for thousands of years. So of course they're doing that right on top of some of the prime archaeological sites. Even in the time that we've been involved with our project, this is an area, one of the necropoli in Shahat. We had identified it during the initial training class. That area in red had been identified as an area that really merited intensive survey on the part of the department. And before that could happen, somebody was already in there with a bulldozer clearing it out, leveling land to have a flat spot to build up some rest houses. And the good news is that, of course, we're hearing about this a little bit. This is making its way into the international press. The bad news is that the way in which we're talking about it is not correct. In that, you know, this area of the of more or less the Acropolis of Shahat, it hasn't been lost. It's still there, but people are just building houses, you know, small rest houses because they can make a quick profit. When honeymooners come up there and are willing to spend $150 a night. And of course, so much of the loss that continues even outside of these parameters is just coming from our own exuberance. We uncovered an awful lot, our community did. And that was at a time where we maybe did have a different idea about how we would present sites, and we maybe don't do these things anymore. But in any case, an awful lot is open, an awful lot continues to just be bit by bit munched by roots and is a lot less legible for future generations. To take a step back, region-wide, you know, Libya is still just the smallest country in terms of population. But in the last 50 years, Libya has more than quadrupled in population. And region-wide, the region as a whole, in terms of its population, has almost tripled. Now, out of the entire planet, in that same 50-year period, you know, the planet has only about doubled. So region-wide, for those of us interested in North Africa, it's a place where the pace of change is more intense than it is other places in this world. And to think about the largest city in the region, Cairo, here it is back in 1975, here it is in 2000. And any time that you're trying to make an argument in favor of the dead at the expense of the living will win. So to get some sense of where is there some bright side in all of this, in all of those new people living in North Africa, we're living through one of the most productive and exuberant periods that region has known. And even for those of us who have been thinking about the long-term past of that region, we must say that right now, never have there been more people living there with a higher standard of living than are there right now. And those people, amongst them, are a lot of potential allies in this. If what we want to do is pass these sites, pass this heritage on through time. This is the same Egyptian museum on the day that it reopened after the revolution. A whole bunch of people from the Tahrir and from the Scouts and from local archaeology faculties welcoming anybody who was willing to show up. That message can take many forms, and for instance, since 2009, National Geographic has had its Arabic language feed going all the time. It's something that when I walk into houses all over, from very small villages to fancy Tony places in Cairo, people watch this because it's interesting. Now, I wish they weren't watching this thing about man versus speed, which is like, I guess, how they're describing a roller coaster. But there's a way in which some of the content, some of the stories we're interested in telling can find a place here. Now, also, we're getting better at documenting things faster and with greater accuracy, and I really am interested in photogrammetry and the promise that it has for connecting some three-dimensional things to a lot of the two-dimensional maps that we've been making. I'd love to talk to you guys at greater length about that. But why are we doing this? We're doing this because here's this girl whose dad is an archaeologist in Shahat, and she really, she will be out there. She really could become, a member of our community. But she can only do that if she has the material to actually work with. And all of us here, we're desperate to have that material. And our community is part of this. We do need to continue to help in whatever ways that we can to make sure that there actually are things to study when she's ready to study them. So, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, let's go.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you to the organizers, Sue, Andy, and Corey, and that other guy, whatever his name was. My students from the Archaeology of North Africa class from this summer are here today, and I believe they've learned a great deal from all the wonderful talks. I certainly know I have, so thank you all. As the last speaker, I feel I can kind of wrap it up like that. Today I'm giving a talk called Pairing Archaeology and Ethnography at Zita, Tunisia, Correlation and Disjuncture. So there's been a checkered past of the uses of ethnography and archaeology, to put it as euphemistically as possible. What we're really dealing with here is the creation of analogy. It is well known that analogies connecting people of the archaeological past and the ethnographic present over thousands of years have been used by colonial administrations to highlight the unchanging, fossilized nature of their colonial subjects. This was then used to provide justification for colonial appropriations and disenfranchisement. Today I'm going to talk about our project in Tunisia, the Zita project, describing how we use ethnographic analogy in our archaeological interpretations, and how we fit in the scheme of analogy creation following all of the critical debunking of the colonial paradigm, as has been lucidly described by scholars such as Alison Wiley, Peter Whiteley, Paul Lane, among others. We do this in a materials-based way, in what has been called ethnoarchaeometry, without commenting on the social or cultural continuity between ancient and modern producers. This is, in essence, today, a methodological paper. It's a case study about how we are forming our research design using ethnography and archaeology. It is about the do's and the won'ts of combining archaeology and ethnography in Zarzis. Now, the conception that we had when starting the Zita project was to study the culture and the history of the region from prehistory to the post-Arab Spring. In other words, we were looking to facilitate research in Tripolitania, both ethnographic and archaeological, without a presumption of drawing analogies between the ancient and the modern people. So the idea is that in order to create hypotheses and create research agenda, we need to create an umbrella to facilitate that kind of research. And I would point out that until now, all of our ethnographers are Tunisian. So my talk will be divided into 3 brief sections. First, I'll give a little overview about the Zita project and our perceptions of analogy. Next, I'll be talking about our ethnography that includes migration from Tunisia to Europe and traditional crafts and how those are related. And finally, ethnoarchaeometry, our actual case study, raw materials ethnography, and some archaeological results. So we work in Tripolitania, okay? This is the ancient urban landscape of Tripolitania. Our site is at Zita. So Tripoli, the 3 cities of Tripolitania, as we all know, Lepsis, Magna, Oya, Sabratha. Well, Tripolitania has another Tripoli as well, if you will, which is Zita, Menanx, and Jigti. Okay, now we have many different research questions. Today, the one that is most relevant to our talk is looking at 2 major features of our site. One is the Roman Forum, the other is the Neo-Punic Tophet. The Roman Forum is the colonial administration center of the Romans, and through a Claudian inscription, we know that it was built or improved between 41 and 54 AD. We've been excavating 2 seasons in the Tophet. That is the Punic sacrifice zone. It's a Punic sanctuary, and we find that it also dates to the Roman control of the area. And specifically, sacrifices stop in the Tophet around 50 to 100 AD, right around the time of the Claudian inscription. So we'd like to know, we have questions about resistance and cultural resilience, okay, among other things. Okay, this is the modern urban landscape of Tripolitania, and some major sites. Galala is one of the places that we have done some ethnography. The Amazigh groups there, and Homatsuk is sort of the major urban center now of the island of Jerba, the mayor of which, as some of you know, is our Punic ceramicist, Sami bin Tahar. So we treat analogy as a starting point, not a terminus. Our fundamental is based upon Alison Wiley. The use of analogical inference and archaeological research should be strictly limited. Analogy should serve only as a means of generating hypotheses whose credibility must be established on independent, non-analogical grounds. So therefore, it's not enough to say there's a connection between this ethnographic people and this archaeological past. If you can even draw it, that's just the beginning. Okay, then you can start forming hypotheses about behavior. Okay, the ways analogy are created between ethnography and archaeology. Okay, so today I'm not going to talk about how ethnography has been used, okay, such as the management of colonial populations or as in salvage ethnography, but rather the conceptual framework of how we form analogy. Now, salvage ethnography, we are actually doing some of that, okay? Because of all of the migration, because of the decrease in traditional crafts, certainly we are documenting some of these traditional crafts that are disappearing. Okay, here's some won'ts on top. To perceive of analogy, to look at a people as fossil, unchanging process of othering, an atheoretical pre-paradigmatic moralizing description. These first 2 are mostly occurring in the 19th century, but did persist after that. Okay, here's a disjuncture. Okay, this Zarzis blacksmith, okay, we cannot tie him to our Neo-Punic metallurgical industry, all right? There has been so much in the way of technological change, technological imports, and sociocultural change in the last 1,700 years since our metallurgical zone was abandoned, that there is no way it necessitates a break between those comparisons. Okay, that hopefully seems obvious. Okay, some things that we are doing. Well, a formal analogy. Okay, you look at similar object or context equals similar properties. Okay, a relational analogy is when you have an abundance of formal analogies, a multitude, and shared properties are determined through a multitude of the formal analogies, and you can start generating hypotheses. A raw materials focused, natural science-based reconstruction of technology, ethnoarchaeometry. Ding, 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 that is one thing we're doing. Showing how the same environment can elicit different cultural responses. All right, one very important aspect of using ethnography and archaeology is that different cultures will react to the exact same environment in different ways. So therefore, saying, well, if the environment is the same, then this people has been unchanging through time. You can't do that. And you can sometimes use a direct historical approach, where you can show a group that has been so insulated that their archaeological remains in that region is tied to them. Then you can start maybe looking at processes of change. That has been done successfully on our continent in Eastern Africa by Peter Schmidt, looking at some of the archaeometallurgy over centuries and millennia. Okay, ethnographic methodology oriented towards the formation processes, to actually design an ethnographic model based on discard and use and reuse, the things that you care about as an archaeologist, is what we actually have as our data. And then finally, of course, using analogy as a starting point from which to create a research agenda. So what are some of the things that we are doing ethnographically? Okay, these are things that don't have to do with archaeology. We look at irregular migration. Okay, we're looking at migration of modern residents of Zarzis and also Tunis into Europe. Okay, the idea is that they're seeking a better life. Okay, unemployment in Tunisia is worse than it was before the Arab Spring right now. Okay, people are seeking greener pastures. Okay, the ones who are a little bit more wealthy, they can get to France immediately. The ones who aren't take clandestine, incredibly dangerous boats, fishing boats, over to Lampedusa, over to Sicily, hoping eventually to make it into France. Okay, these are often wrecked. Okay, there's a great loss of life. It's a severe plight. The idea is that they will get there and they'll send remittances back, and of course some do. And that's why you have, this is what our ethnographers would call provocation. All right, you have people displaying the symbols of Europe so that people think, okay, I can get that too, I can get that too. But in reality, before the revolution, before the Arab Spring, Tunisians that were caught were tortured, brutally tortured by the regime. And since then, those that have actually made it face enormous discrimination and discriminatory policies on the other side. And many are lost. Okay, so the reputation of Tunisians in Italy, in Sicily, where some of our research has gone across the pond to look at, you actually have Tunisians seen as the worst criminals. Generally, people prefer to hire Bangladeshis or Moroccans instead of Tunisians, which are some of the other immigrant populations. This leads back to the traditional crafts that are left behind. The younger generation, this is not a growth industry. There is a very nice tourism industry in Zarzis and Djerba, but this is not a growth industry. Okay, so you have traditional crafts that are being abandoned. All right, so this is an aspect of salvage ethnography, if you will. We also have an aspect of salvage archaeology on our site, unrelated, due to intense looting practices that were occurring before the Tunisian Institut National du Patrimoine, the Antiquities Department, stepped in and put an end to it. And we were the first research project to sign a permit with them to begin working there. So here is a basket maker, okay? I showed you blacksmith before. We also have saddle makers. Soap maker. These are often cottage industries being done in a home or a very small workshop. Okay, from making soap to bringing them to market. We have weavers and we have tailors. And we should have a video, but this mouse has been giving me problems in all the practice runs. So, on the screen? Oh, hey, thank you very much. That is very good to know. All right. Okay, so Fatih is very aware that he's a traditional potter, okay, which necessitates a break again. Okay, he does not think that all of his vessels are going to store food like they would have thousands of years ago. He knows that he makes traditional pottery. This has also been demonstrated by Maria Anís in Sardinia. There's a very strong awareness of the potters. They know that the market has changed severely. So, no, his practices of pottery production, we cannot comment on our Tophet urns, okay, where the sacrifices are deposited. But he did bring us to his clay source in Galala. Okay, and here you can see Dennis Brakeman's archaeometrist, and he's in the audience today. All right, led to the clay source, showed us how they were getting the clay, and showing us all these galleries. Correlation. Okay, we can actually start looking at the sourcing, the provenience of those raw materials, all right, as the beginning of a formal analogy, a natural sciences-based raw materials analogy. Here is our Tophet, okay, one aspect of it. In this 1.5 by 3 trench, there are 6 urns that we recovered. All right, so we're interested in the sacrificial practices of resistance. We're interested in what can we look at to see the resilience of the cultures, of the autochthonous cultures, as they are dealing and grappling with a new colonial landscape. So we apply ethno-archaeometric practices. Okay, we begin with radiology just to see what's inside, non-invasively. And indeed, we can identify bones in many of these Tophet urns before microexcavation can proceed. Okay, handheld XRF, in addition to a number of other techniques, we look at the sourcing. Okay, so we can see, based upon thorium and zirconium, chromium and nickel concentrations, and we're also developing new isotope techniques using zirconium, developing new ways to really pinpoint clay beds, exact clay beds. We're not quite there yet, but we're working on that. And what do we see here? Well, the local clays and soils, we have our crucibles from the industrial, we have our wasters, we have a lot of commonware and cookware, and lo and behold, we have our Tophet urns, our local clay, whereas all the other kinds of what you might call finer ware are being imported, except those Tophet urns. All right, so we're going to continue to using petrography, using portable XRF and other methods. We are developing new methods to pinpoint those exact locations, heavy mineral analysis. All right, so what do we get? Well, we have formed a formal ethno-archaeometric analogy with the archaeological record by tying the clay source to the ceramic vessels. All right, that is just the beginning of the research process, okay? Not the end. So if we can pinpoint the exact locations, continue on, we can form further hypotheses to then test. So here's the case study. What is our formal ethno-archaeometric analogy? Well, the commonware in industrial vessels, such as crucibles and kiln wasters, are comprised of local fabrics. Okay, all other vessels are made from non-local, meaning outside German Zarzis fabrics, except for the Tophet urns. We have Tripolitanian fabrics that are a little bit further afield than the German Zarzis Peninsula. So now that we know that, we can form an hypothesis. Industrial vessels are made locally due to the high cost introduced in moving large amounts of materials. The Tophet vessels, used for a distinctly non-Roman practice, are made locally due to an autochthonous preference that ties the people to their material and ritual landscape as a form of resistance against Roman colonial administration. Now we have to test that hypothesis through a number of other methods. We have to refine the chronologies of the form and the Tophet to see how they align. We have to look at the Tophet urn remains themselves and conduct bioarchaeological analyses to see, are these practices, are these animals, are these human infants? Okay, what is going on? How did the actual sacrifice change? We have to pinpoint the clay beds, the clay sources, to a higher degree to Zita itself, okay, to see how close we actually are to the site. We have to look at other Tophets, and we have to incorporate theories of resistance and resilience. So in conclusion, by removing unscientific and culturally insensitive analogies from our discourse and research design, our theoretical and methodological approach not only increases in scientific validity, but we also maintain a sensitivity to the modern population's consciousness of the recent colonial past. Thank you all very much.
brings us to the present day. Open for questions.
A little worried about the very last conclusion, because of course, as you know, in Germany we have dozens of amphora and other kilns of that period. I mean, both from Punic into Roman, that aren't making topiaries, they're making utilitarian stuff like amphora.
Absolutely. Well, that's why I mentioned that there's two parts to it. One, so the more industrial and common vessels, such as amphora, that will be made locally just because it's cheaper. But then there's the other aspect then, so you have that, okay, but then when you look at the more finer wares, you only have tophet urns that are locally produced. Everything else seems to be imported. But again, this is not our conclusion yet. This is the hypothesis that we then must test. So this is not a lot of times, I feel that when we use analogy, often the scholars will transmit their conclusion immediately without having to test it further. Okay, the idea is by making an analogy, you think that the audience is going to understand directly what you're trying to get at. In this case, no, we have not proven this yet. We haven't proved that has to do with the resistance or resilience. It's what we're interested in. And these are the methods we're trying to get at. But thank you, Lisa. I'd very much like to talk to you about it more.
I have a question for Will. First of all, I was so delighted to see that picture of Monisset, I last saw him in Gadames when we had to drive out, and we thought he was going to get on the plane that afternoon. Of course, he didn't. He couldn't do it because the airport in Tripoli had bombed. And what I was wondering is, so on David's project in Gadames, where I was the field director, we were doing a similar thing, working very closely with our Libyan colleagues and developing new survey techniques, working with them to come up with correct, with Arabic and English recording forms which we figure out we can use. And it was a really exciting time. We were talking about this morning. So much enthusiasm, so much excitement. Now, of course, we can't go back there at the moment. What do you think is the best way for us? You were saying, for us here, you asked for an archaeologist to sort of help.
Yeah. Let's start working in Tunisia and bring them yeah. That's what we think that's where we're going right now. That's kind of, we have the chance hopefully in January to bring over a group related to Libyan museums to come here to the States, and that's been, we're only able to do that because of some special support on the part of the State Department, and even then it's going to be a nightmare with visas. I'm not sure that's going to happen. Tunisia is a place where Libyans can go for the time being, and last spring, Anna Leone hosted training in Sfax, and that was very successful. And if there's a way that we can work now again, in order to really start to do good work in Tunisia, we're going to have to also bring in Tunisian colleagues to really make that work, so that it's not, they were doing GIS training in the spring, and it was really kind of a classroom-based thing. What we need to start thinking about together as a community, and particularly with folks who are actively working on projects in Tunisia, are there ways that we can start to ask Tunisian authorities even, could we invite a Libyan delegation to be a part of this? And is there some way in which we can imagine, and it could be in the context really of just training, so however it's couched, it might not be in an excavation, for instance, at first, but if there's, and those are things where, again, unfortunately, the Libyan Antiquity Authority and the IMP are not going to look for that relationship on their own. They're not going to suddenly do that unless there is, and those of us who are in the middle of that a little bit, we are potentially real facilitators. Now, when we ask, they might still say no, but up until this point, I mean, even for us, we haven't asked because we haven't yet seen or fully imagined the full possibilities, but we're looking for that. So if there are other people here today who are interested in that, I think it's really, I think there's a lot of potential there. We had considered Egypt for a time, and it used to be very easy for Libyans to drive across at Saloum. Now there's a lot of pressure and a lot of back and forth between, there are plenty of people, including a lot of people in this country, who believe that Egypt was responsible for some recent bombing campaigns, or at least helped facilitate Emirati jets. And so that relationship has become fraught. Thank goodness there's still, I think, some opportunity in Tunisia, and we should act as soon as possible. If anybody's interested, we should try to start to imagine how something useful like that could occur.
And I suppose on a practical level too, the archaeology of Tunisia, I mean, in the issues that
Sure.
people face in living mosaics, preserving huge standing Roman remains, etc., and all the desert are the same issues that Tunisians have to deal with. It's a much more similar sort of type of material culture than it is.
We had hoped that maybe there would be an opportunity in ISAW, actually. We were hoping that through that there would be a closer analogy. But in any case, for us as outsiders, we don't get the chance to make the official government choice. But we might be in a position where through years of collaboration, we might be able to make a suggestion that could fall on receptive ears.
What is that little girl learning
About archaeology?
Well, yeah.
About
archaeology.
okay. What's going on in the context of Libyan education right now? Well, they're in the course of a major overhaul of their curriculum, of course. That has not fully been realized. It's not that these ruins had no place in the discourse of the former regime. They were there, they weren't explored in depth. Gaddafi was on both sides of it, depending on the day and what side of the bed he woke up on. So it's not as though we should see it neither as something particularly sensitive. It's while Mussolini was very gifted at appropriating Roman heritage in Italy for his own purposes. Right now, the discourse that this is ancient imperialism is not something that resounds widely. And thanks in large part, really some of the work that was happening right before the revolution, some of these questions that definitely blurred those lines between what could be seen as coming from Rome versus what was happening locally, that helped a lot. That's something that was a message everybody picked up on. And Graham's work at Hoofetea as well is really something, as soon as some of those numbers get tossed around about how long of a continuous record of inhabitation is found at this one site, this is something, it's on Libyan TV. People hear about this kind of stuff. I wish that girl was learning about it in a rigorous curriculum. I wish that she had lots of choices for archaeological faculties to go to. I wish she had foreign languages to engage with a lot of these things and to come here and tell us her own story. These are long, slow things, and will come. But I think for the time being, surprisingly, one of the real sources in which people are learning about things. Yes, they're learning about it occasionally in 140 characters, but there is also a lot of room for substance. And Abu Dhabi Geographic, it's amazing because region-wide, all sorts of questions of natural history and just the broader world, things that were never part of the curriculum, not even with any kind of malign intent, just because the curriculum was weak. These are things that people are knowing about, and they are glued to that channel. It surprised me. So I do. I hope that in the context of Egypt, for instance, a place where a lot of people have spent a lot of money developing content related to ancient Egypt, the unfortunate truth is that none of that is getting developed locally, despite the strength of the Egyptian film and television industry. And unfortunately, up until this point, Abu Dhabi Geographic doesn't have some main thread that's archaeology every Tuesday at 7 p.m. But it could. And again, Abu Dhabi Geographic, we can't wait for them to just suddenly decide that they're going to do it. There is a way to suggest, and we are the right community to make those suggestions.
I might have missed a few details in your presentation, which is wonderful. But I'm wondering, you talked about mapping all the sites along the coast, their proximity to new building activities and this kind of information overload that came back to you by involving the people, all of which needs to be done. But do you also worry that that also puts some sites more at risk when they become more and more on the public radar?
Well, I'd say that particularly with coastal sites right now, anybody who is living near these coastal sites, they know that they're there. Mm-hmm. And again, I wouldn't ascribe a lot of the loss that we're seeing to any particular kind of malign intent. It's really, it's just that, so people aren't looking for a map of sites to then suddenly go and find the next one to destroy or loot.
Yeah, no, that's not to assume that everyone's going to destroy it or that locals are going to destroy it. It's more just, what level of management does this have to be kind of slotted into? Because you have to know about it and people have to do it. But at the same time, any country that, archaeological sites are known, they're, become more and more known, they're automatically more and more dangerous.
And so for the data center, I mean, none of that information is publicly accessible. Okay. I don't even have the latest data. So it's something where, this is a process that we have been contributing to on the side as collaborators, but we're not, it's tough to say, we're not controlling the process right now. I mean, the data center exists. They have a whole bunch of employees paid by the state. Mm-hmm. If they have questions, and we sometimes have the chance to interact with them and talk about data quality issues. We're worried about data quality issues because we know the data is not as good as we would like it to be. Mm-hmm. But that is a process, we were unable to wait to achieve perfect data. So we are going to hope to continue to improve that data. Yeah.
Let me ask you, Will, about funding for all of this.
Yeah.
You say the State Department is supporting some of it. Mm-hmm. The Libyan government seems to be supporting the local employees. How does that all work together? What does funding look like?
Yeah, we've been lucky to find such support in Libya for this. The State Department Ambassador Fund grants are modest. They're not even supposed to pay salaries, so I get some training fees, but really what happens is that we've been able, thank goodness I was able to spend significant periods of time on the ground working intensively with Libyan colleagues. But then because there's been enough interest and because these local councils, again, Libya compared to a lot of its neighbors, we must be honest, Libya is more wealthy, or there's more money to go around for a fewer number of people. So the kind of thing that we see here working in Libya, I know for a fact, having dealt with lots of Egyptian bureaucrats, that it would be a very hard sell. And for them, they do not have some sort of local fund that they can conveniently dip into and support some kind of crew to come in and work. These are, so I can't say that this is immediately universally applicable everywhere and it's always going to be easy to find funding. We've been fortunate so far in these first steps with a little bit of momentum that sure enough, these local communities to spend, $5,000 or $8,000 to host a group for a couple of weeks to conduct a field survey, that's something they are able to do. And that is probably not the case in Tunisia, not the case in Egypt, not the case in Algeria, not the case in Morocco. So, yeah.
But, the director of the data center, Mike Student Mufta, he is not paid full time or not enough. So he's working at one of the universities part-time. So it is hand-to-mouth. And one of the problems in Libya is that consistently over the last 20, 30 years, they have spent a fraction on their antiquities service what Tunisia and Morocco, even Algeria spend. It's extraordinarily underfunded.
And that, again, they continue to be at the very end of the pecking order in many ways. Yeah. And the way in which they get interest is finding ways to talk about it. And that we as a community can do some of that. We've certainly been in the position on occasion to meet various ministers, for instance, in one way or another. Libya is a small enough place where sometimes that happens. But ultimately that is something they have to make their own case. We would have a hard time setting the national budget in the way that we would like to set it, unfortunately. But finding ways to strengthen, our colleagues and help them make that case by providing them good information and some of the results of our own research, they are ready to take that information and run with it. It helps them a lot. I mean, our community is a tremendous resource for them, and they know it.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Just to continue with this, Will, I mean, can you say a little bit more about why you think there was such a popular upswell of interest, you know, once you started this project? I mean,
yeah.
I mean, is it just simply that it had been repressed for so long under Gaddafi, or is there a kind of more productive explanation?
I think on the pragmatic side of things, there aren't too many people in Libya who are thinking in terms of making a request for money from the local government to do a specific project. So that, if there was suddenly, 20 different civil society groups lining up, with their plan, they might have said no more frequently. These local councils are supporting a number of endeavors, but at the same time, I think we're somewhat lucky in that this was something that the timing, we did manage to sometimes get there first. And the amount that we were asking for, or the department, the data center was asking for, is again based on the budget of these local councils. It's a modest amount. At the same time, in the mountain in particular, in the Nafusa, there is something very unusual there. There is, and we felt it immediately. The way in which it's no accident that Yefren was the first community to reach out to the department, and the department didn't go to Yefren and said, we would like to send our recent students to become trainers. Yefren went to the department because, for a lot of reasons, in the Berber community, at least in Libya, we have seen, as part of reassertion of identity, and I think also, a real effort to try and claim what they see as their rightful piece of the pie. That they weren't going to wait around, and actually until recent months, there were only 2 people employed full-time by the Department of Antiquities for the entire area stretching from, let's just say, right outside of the outskirts of Tripoli, all the way to the Tunisian border, including the Damas. All of that was lumped together. 2 people. Actually, Sabrata was their headquarters is their headquarters for that particular inspectorate. So, that's the Nafusa region. They were just eager because they know they've got a lot of field survey they'd like to do. They have been doing it on their own in fits and starts, and they've also been doing a lot of restoration work of local buildings, local mosques, even local synagogues that have long been left to abandon. I would really encourage you, conditions permitting, to consider engaging with that community.
It is 4:30, which means it's time for the next panel. Thank you both very much.
Okay. Okay. Right. I know a lot of people in this room are jet lagged, including me. So why doesn't everyone stand up and stretch? I'm certainly going to do it. Oh, God. What's that? Yes. Don't go away for long. Just walk. Yes, this is not an invitation to flee. Yeah, just a stretch. Andy is suggesting star jumps, whatever. Would you like to demonstrate? What's that? No, I have no idea what he's talking about. So, all right.
See, you know.
I do know. All right. We don't have the shits for a second. Okay, so what happens now? We have about an hour before another reception. Just to try, remember where we started this morning? I was hoping that we can put something together, chain ideas together that leaves us with some sort of package. And I think everyone who's spoken has been wonderful and has tossed something into the pot. And now we have the pot. It's got lots of bits in it. let's see what we can cook up, as they say. So there's no real agenda. The four of us will stand here like stuffed dummies and do our best to moderate or intervene. We certainly have some things we'd like to hear more about. But for the moment, we'll open up the floor and see what directions would people like to go. Professor Wilson.
So this is just a question on what the state of the field means. I mean, I've enjoyed this enormously, but why are there no North Africans here? And why are there no French?
As I alluded to in the introduction last night, when we started these, almost entirely the first few instances, for budgetary reasons, we could not bring in many overseas people. And so therefore we said, okay, we'll make a virtue of necessity and sort of delimit largely who we're inviting. And also because it was like, in the North American community, or more broadly Anglophone community, if you're talking about what can we do, or how do we intersect with it, so that was where it started. In this, as we've sort of moved through countries, it's been harder, largely because we moved into countries where there's not very much North American interest, such as until recently Iberia, and certainly as is still the case in North America. So this is actually a broader international community. Some invitations did go out to French scholars and to North Africa, to Tunisian scholars, and they could not come. So it's an issue we've always had with these things. It cannot be because just the bottom line in many ways, we can't bring in everyone that we would like to bring in, so we try to have as representative as possible.
And as you know, I mean, this is a huge issue for us, trying to get our North African colleagues over. It's very, very difficult to get visas. Yeah. I mean, you know this. We had a conference on the Aghlabids, so the 9th century dynasty in London, and we had a lot of money to bring North Africans over, and we were supposed to have 15 colleagues come over from North Africa, and only 4 of them were able to get a visa. I mean, we had all the funding, we had all the invitations, and that's Britain. Britain is very difficult because it's not part of the Schengen. Other parts of Europe can be a little bit easier to get to. The States is exactly the same. And it takes months to do this. All those invitations went out, and all the applications went into the British Foreign Office 4 or 5 months before the conference, and they still didn't come through in time. So this is it's a massive issue. Like how do we do this? And so what Will was alluding to is it's very difficult to get our Libyan colleagues, for example, out of Libya, but easy to get them into Tunisia.
And we can get there too. I mean,
yes,
and
that's
the other ground where we can.
Yeah, France, please.
Istanbul is also right now, at least for Libyans, a very reasonable place. And for all of us,
I was going to say.
Perfect.
Tom.
Well, as an Africanist archaeologist, this is something we deal with all the time in West Africa and different groups. And so what we end up doing is we have the conferences in Africa more often than not, because the North American and the European community can get into these places much easier, and it's much easier in Africa for the scholars to move between the countries and go that way. So kind of a lot of what a lot of the groups have done is they've sort of made a European North American meeting, and then the next time they have the meeting, they'll have it somewhere in Africa and go back and forth. But it is a challenge. I mean, logistically, it's a serious challenge.
Well, in a way, that it's the idea is to basically to develop the Jacassi and Sufi archaeology in the ancient world. So we want to do for this community of people. So it's Istanbul or over there. I think the conversation has to continue. But in this case, we're in Rhode Island. Other areas of Laurel.
Sort of jumping off the issue of access, one thing that I noticed between two of the sessions, that in the first session on urbanism, it's very clear that some of the most interesting questions that are being generated are about periods both before and after the Roman and late antique periods. It's also clear that access is a problem, and that one thing we need to consider, as came out in the session that I moderated, was that how do we deal with legacy data? But as became very clear, in fact, the legacy data people were looking at Roman and late antique questions. And I'm wondering if as access gets more difficult, if this is going to further a problem that's already been there in the field, which is this overemphasis on the Roman and late antique periods, or is there anything we can do with heritage data that can address some of the questions about early periods?
Well, I don't know a damn thing about North Africa, so let's throw open the.
It was one thing that I also had noticed, that one of the major common themes, not just in that session, was the idea that there's a lack of data, all types of data. There's a lack of archaeological data, there's a lack of survey data, there's a lack of metallurgical data, there's always some sort of lack. So the idea to have projects that are looking at the legacy data is certainly something that seems very fruitful. And I think that it's something generally in archaeology, people, they maybe don't want to do that. They want to go and dig more instead of looking, because it's a much more arduous task to have to get that going. But without a specific answer, I think that certainly, obviously, it's always great to have new data as well, okay? But I think a focus on legacy data is definitely one takeaway to try to synthesize it and to try to put it in databases and look at it in different ways, essentially, than has been before.
I think there's loads of potential to look. I mean, okay, so most of our data does come from that is the history of scholarship, and there's loads more that can be done with that data, as Andrew's doing. But there is also a lot of information out there on the group which hasn't been looked at. So, for example, we still don't have a very good map of prehistoric tombs across North Africa. That could be mapped. They're recorded. That could be put together. There's nothing on the Ottoman periods. There's nothing on the early colonial period. There's nothing really. I mean, medieval archaeology is poorly studied as it is, but we don't even have a map of, say, 9th century monuments, and there are loads of them. There are loads of fortifications which have been built in the groups, which we know where they are. They're still standing. They've been described at various points in their history. We could go back and visit them. We could build better maps and databases of these different periods, but we just have to do it. And that's the challenge. But it is definitely possible to do more than what is currently being done to push that data a bit further. Although it would be nice to do more excavations.
Right. Well, actually, one thing that's actually interesting is that there was this moment when survey was the only game in town in North Africa, and there's still one survey that might still be ongoing, which is Mariette de Vos in eastern Algeria. But the chances of her publishing it are small. And that's it. And we're all digging with it. And it's quite interesting, I mean, listening to Will's talk and the suggestion about Tunisia combined with Brad's project, it seems to me that one place you could do a really useful and interesting survey that would fit both of your issues would be the Zarzis Peninsula. I mean, that would, there's a lot of research questions that work in, and you've got the relationships and the infrastructure set up. And this could be a Tunisian, a Libyan training ground as well.
Yeah.
Huh.
Well, this
but
is,
apart from that, the last survey was 10 years.
This is something you're seeing. You're seeing this on a much wider scale too. You know, there's with access to collections, with access to permits, with access to excavation, all this kind of stuff. The survey stuff is now starting to see a rebound in a lot of regions. You know, in the Middle East and other parts of the world. You know, it's a lot less financial investment. You can get tremendous amounts of data with the GPS and various recording systems we have available now. You can record huge amounts of data very quickly. And it's easy to get the local populations involved, going back to what you're saying, and they appreciate that engagement, and so I think, in terms of, not just legacy data, but generating new data that's useful, I think that's an avenue now which is opening up a lot more as others start to shut down, and so I think, sometimes sort of shifting.
Lighter weight.
Yeah.
An
Shifting the
example
focus.
of this would be one of our things at Leicester, you're working with David with Transharbour. We spent a lot of time looking at the Google Earth imagery and finding thousands, right, of new sites. Can't always date them, but it is generating new data.
Yeah, I wondered about remote stuff. Steve, and then
my question, I guess, follows on a bit from Laurel's. She mentioned the Roman period. I want to come back to that and come back to, I guess, the beginning of the day and maybe target my question towards Corey and David, which is that you've both shown the kind of extraordinary contributions that can be made if you move away from the status quo and start to get sort of underneath the Roman period, the pre-Roman periods, and then also sort of above it, the thin air, it seems, in the later material. So, given the contributions you've been able to make to those periods, if you were each kind of dragged, kicking and screaming, it would seem, into the Roman period, what kinds of contributions remain to be made in that period? Maybe based off what you're learning yourselves, or just what do you want from the Roman period that you're not getting?
Stories, as opposed to monuments. I mean, we have artworks and we have monuments from those wonderful Roman towns, and that's the approach that fundamentally, I think, underscores a lot of the work that's been done with the current prior research agenda. What I think we were pointing out is that there are other stories to tell. It's not just, those monuments stood me there, still being marvelled at. Hopefully by lots of people will still visit these sites, and the tourism is really important in the economy of Tunisia, and will continue to be so. But we can still, I think, tell different, more complicated and more interesting stories. And I think those stories are actually really important in terms of how they engage North Africans with their past, even if they think, this is old people who have nothing to do with me, but it's still their country and in the spaces they inhabit. And the fact that there are stories to tell about these things that aren't just, well, foreigners came and they built this stuff. I think that's a really powerful thing. And I think in the long term, that's crucial for the preservation of the archaeology, but also, to allow interested Europeans and Americans who want to go and do work there, to go and be able to do that. It's, as Will said, that the states in North Africa are responsible for the state of archaeology, and we do not have an agenda that really is fit for purpose.
On this point?
To follow up on that, in answer to Steve's question, I think we need a lot more on sub-elite housing. We need more on workshops and manufacturing. The number of urban sites with quantified animal bone assemblages, you could probably count the fingers over one hand. The excavations of rural sites are virtually zilch. We know this was a landscape of villas, and one has been dug, Nador, and then a few coastal villas.
Oh, 4!
3 more.
Embarrassment of riches.
That's the kind of orders of magnitude. We know nothing about sub-villa rural settlement much in terms of excavated assemblages, beyond what has been found by a field survey. There are huge gaps.
Yeah.
It's been an archaeology of the colonialist period, and that agenda has carried through after the French and the Italians left. Extraordinarily, really. There's the sort of even the emphasis in the 1970s on resistance to Romanization didn't actually produce a new archaeological agenda in terms of field work. So it's actually really difficult to compare North Africa with other provinces. You can't compare it with the other side of the Mediterranean because we just don't have grounds for comparison.
Bruce, on this.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
The previous speakers have actually picked up on things I was going to comment on. And one thing that strikes me is that Africa, I'd say, we use the word Roman Africa. Everybody else we say, Gallo-Roman, Hispano-Roman. We don't put Roman in front. We still put Roman in front in Africa, which is an interesting problem. But one of the problems is that we still haven't disembedded the history of Africa in the Roman period from the colonial experience. And that, in a way, that it is, in some ways, it's now seen as something like the antithesis of what we've talked about today. And one of the nice things about what was good about today was to filling out all the rest of this, most importantly. But that now does create an agenda for us to ask, we do need to work with the notion that the Roman period in Africa is not to be disembedded from the experience of Africa, and it shouldn't be seen, strictly speaking, as the inverse, of the indigenous experience. And in the 1970s, when I was teaching in the University of 1980s in the University of Tunis, the vision of the Romans as being no different than the French was very strong in those days. And there was also a Marxist approach to the process was now gone. That's so passé. That's so not part of the question where we need to be with regard to Roman Africa, that I'm troubled in one sense that the abandonment of the key questions. For example, you could say that one good area to work is that rural survey has gotten ahead of urban work on the Roman, in Roman Africa. It's time to get back and ask more questions about something other than the monuments, as David says. Other than the core things that we associate with those institutions. There's much work to be done. But the problem ultimately at the end of the day is that Roman Africa is not settled history. It's not what, you could argue that for example, in places like France, it's, the debate's over. They bought that it's Roman Gaul is part of the national experience. It's not part of the national, it's not, the debate's not over. And that does impede the study of it for its own sake. And in some ways we have a problem ourselves in the sense that we come in, if we are not interested in it as part of the national history of these countries, if in some ways it's something of a different form of a colonial agenda. In other words, I can honestly say that perhaps I'm not so interested in how this relates to the larger, longer term history of Tunisia as a nation state. And that still creates an outsider's agenda. It's a bit of a problem. And I don't know, we have to be more conscious of what we bring to it in terms of our own ideological and, our own perspectives on our culture than we are why we do this. Do we have an interest that relates to the nation state and what it means for the nation state? Anyway, these are just questions to pose.
You can't just say, well, thank God we're not French and we do it, without realizing that we have our own.
It would be interesting to have a French person, for example, a scholar like Laveau, continues to go back every year and is invited back. Here's the other thing, the final comment I'm making this, is that there's not been necessarily a rejection on the part of North African countries with engagement in terms of their relationship to Europe. They still want parts of that relationship. And so we have to confront the fact that what we may think they want is not necessarily the same thing as what they want.
Jen, you had a...
I'm sorry.
No, please.
Okay. So this is related to what Bruce is saying. It's something that we've sort of talked around, I think, but haven't directly engaged with, and something I don't know. What are from all of your senses of active people working in this region, what are the sort of intellectual priorities of your colleagues, the scholars working on the ground there, who are not thinking simply in terms, like Will was talking about, having the resources to preserve, but what are the intellectual questions that they want to answer? I mean, is domestic, being able to talk about domestic context of non-elite houses something that's important to the younger scholars who will actually set the agenda? I mean, what is it that they want to work on?
Well, think about the Francophone tradition first.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons that the old colonial agendas have not changed significantly or fast has been that classically, the Tunisian or the Algerian goes to do a PhD on churches or mosaics or inscriptions or Roman architecture, and it perpetuates those sub-interests in that next generation. So that's gone on for some time. And I think this is where some of the more recent training that we've been able to do is to get North African students coming to the UK or to the US to learn skills and to acquire, to do research on rather different sort of things, which are about, these stories, which are about the relationship of people to the landscape, or to technology and things like that. And those things, I think, we're at an early stage in terms of the number of people we put back into the system. But I think that that is part of the way that one can actually change those mentalities. But I mean, yeah, I'm not so sure it's going to happen as fast in France. But
So can I just tie
Please,
on to that?
yeah,
So it comes back to Steve's question. I mean, it's difficult to dig a crappy house if you haven't been trained very well in stratigraphy and how to identify post holes and stuff. I mean, it's much easier to strip a nice stone temple down and find it. But it takes training to do that. It takes training to excavate a burial and be able to understand taphonomy. It takes training to do isotope analysis and all of those things. And that's what's still only just coming. But that sort of training and that sort of getting more North Africans, colleagues, and more of us doing that sort of work will create or will help generate those stories of the things we don't understand, like the non-elite populations of people living in the countryside, or what it meant to be, like late antiquity or the transition. Was it that bad? We should be able to tell those stories from people's bones, but we haven't yet.
Can I just come back on the French side? I mean, I did examine a PhD in Lyon last December by a French-Algerian woman on workshops, workshop production. It's a brilliant piece of work, and absolutely the sort of work we need. There's another French-Tunisian who's doing work on kilns in southern Tunisia. Again, that's exactly the sort of project that we need to change some of the skill base and the sort of research questions that are being asked.
So we should come back to about communications and networks. Why do Jen and Murphy should know those people? How do we make that happen? Laura,
It was just a reaction again to say that this is fascinating and we're opening things up, but we're still talking about what skills and questions we are giving to the people there. We're not talking about indigenous interests and questions generated from within that community. And I do think that we, by teaching skills, we open up the possibility for new types of questions perhaps, but it is still a somewhat troubling relationship between us and questions and skills and the people who are going to be working on the ground.
Well, I think there are signs of hope, because I think some of those impetuses are actually coming locally. I mean, I'm not sure where Twahira Abrawi, whose thesis you examined, got her idea for that subject from. It may have been local, it may have been in France, but other Libyan colleagues, Ahmed Huzan has been doing a survey of oil and wine presses in Cyrenaica. Your student, Dr. Haddad, did a survey of the Tahina Plateau. There is a local interest now in agricultural production and elements of the economy, which is, nothing happens in a vacuum, and this is feeding into larger debates and drawing from larger debates on the economy and rural production and so on. But that's, I think that there is a set of encouraging signs that scholars from the region are moving away from the colonialist period agenda of major monuments. But another issue has been language skills. And when I first started working in Libya in the mid-1990s, foreign languages were not allowed to be taught in Libya. So very few of the people we worked with spoke any language, Arabic. That has now changed, and we're now seeing students with, for the first time in the last few years, with the linguistic skills to go and study abroad in Britain. There have been the privileged links between Tunisia and France. Now that is widening out.
I'd be curious to know how many students are studying in the United Kingdom or indeed in the States. Lisa, are you?
Yeah, I wanted to answer Jen's question with the fact that the Tunisians now, whereas you're right that the older generation did churches, the younger generation all want to do Punic, and there's two reasons for that, besides the nationalist business of Punic. But Mohammed Fantar pair simply blocked anyone from studying Punic, going to France and studying Punic stuff. And so until he retired, because he wanted to keep it for his son, he was the only person who could out study. This is true. And Sami Ben Hattad, I don't know whether you know, actually had to go to France saying he was doing something else, and then he started studying Punic. But now all of the young, bright colleagues are studying Punic pottery, studying Punic archaeology in general, and we've completely lost any interest in major monuments.
Well, and the project that I'm trying to get going with a Tunisian colleague and another British colleague in Budaregia, they want us, or Mohadine, our colleague, wants us to come and do it. It's a Christian cemetery physical survey because he wants us to do it properly and to train local Tunisians in how to deal with human remains and how to do that, but also to train them how to do geophysics. So this is a project which was devised together, but it's very much common. The things that we're doing, I mean, we want to do them too, but they were explicit that we needed to do those things and that we could provide, we could help provide new opportunities for Tunisian students and young researchers to do that. But they were specific that that's what we were there to do. They didn't want us to go and map the forum or something. No. Thank goodness. Paul.
Yeah, no, this is all very interesting, and obviously I don't know the archaeology side of this, but just thinking about it from the cultural side, the other kinds of ways in which you have these intersections of different kind of academic traditions. It's clear that when we talk about what do the local folks want, what is an indigenous archaeological demands, that we have to be very careful because of course there's there are multiple of them. They don't map onto the nation states desires, and even though we presumably we depend on the states for funding and for research permits, that that we need to be sensitive also to like all sorts of indigenous projects we've been hearing from a lot of different people here. So that there's first that side. Second, even what kind of the state or these states are wanting seems to be changing under fate, right? And even their orientation in terms of the kind of ways that they situate themselves within kind of communities of discourse seems to be kind of increasingly shifting away, at least in the Moroccan, the Algerian, and I'm not sure about the Tunisian case, away from the kind of focus towards France along to a broader kind of broader European and even North American kind of direction. And that's true if you look at where the students are going to study as well. Increasingly a younger generation of North African scholars, at least as I see from the historians and cultural anthropologists, are being trained in the United States and Britain and elsewhere, Germany maybe to a lesser extent. And then the third thing I was going to say is that even if they're going to France, French academia is itself changing, right? It's increasingly globalized. It's increasingly a younger generation that isn't just kind of quite so kind of dogmatically kind of interested in a single thing. So I don't think we should do a disservice to our French colleagues by saying that by putting them into the same boat, because it's if you spend time with the younger generation scholars there, you see that their orientation is much to a broader set of issues that aren't just simply being.
It is important to point out that the French Foreign Ministry still has specific official relationships with all three states through and the mission archéologique of the government of France is tied into the Foreign Ministry. And it's part of, and the agenda for work that continues to be done is still partly set by those relationships. That's why they continue to have invitations to come back. The states in the Maghreb want to expand that relationship because they don't want it to be monopolistic. But the French government has a continuing interest in seeing work being done by French scholars, and their agenda is not necessarily to raise necessarily a whole set of new ideological questions. They continue to work in the mainstream and doing a lot of work, like for example right now in Caesarea they're publishing the inscriptions, okay? At Cherchell, they're publishing the inscriptions. That good work still needs to be done, and that's part of the mission archéologique. So we have to be aware that this does play out at the level of power politics. And Paul's absolutely right about, that's what I mean about the fact not being settled. The work here is so affected by the cross-cutting political agendas at this stage. And we're sort of going in and sort of trying to stabilize it with a set of questions that maybe in some ways it makes for a real challenging environment, very challenging environment.
Brett, agree?
So I guess this whole discussion has been the question is what do the Maghrebi scholars want? What do they want to know? And I think that the answer is that's why we need to always partner with them. Okay, it's something that everyone in this room I think takes as obvious. But I'm only familiar with the Tunisian laws, not the other states, but certainly the Tunisians now require an equal partnership. But even in instances where it's not required, we need to seek that out, because the only way to actually know those questions are if we're incorporating. We all have biases. We have our own cultural biases, we have individual biases, we have at the level of the nation state biases, and the only way to actually begin to rectify them is through very close partnership. And I think a lot of times the scholars who live there, their research question is also, well, what are you interested in too? And you have a dialogue. It's always to keep the sort of the dialogue going. And if you're working with them in the trench every day, then it can keep on it's reflexive and it can keep on informing itself and being informed. So that's sort of at an institutional level, where it's to encourage that type of partnership. And all European, American, Maghrebi, all at the levels of universities and governments even.
Is this going to get our students jobs?
Yes.
I hope. Well, it got me one.
No, that was a slightly facetious thing just to toss in. Yeah, so go ahead.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, that actually raises a specific problem of North American classical archaeology.
Yep.
Because you don't have archaeology departments except for this institute and one or two others. Classical archaeology lives in classics or it lives in art history. And people doing the economy or the settlement patterns of North Africa are not mainstream in those departments. So if this kind of stuff is going to continue, it's going to continue here, in Brown. In this institute, if it's going to happen in the US.
Well, I know,
mean,
right?
There's a big difference in research this side of the pond and my side of the pond.
No, I'm not particularly concerned about it. Sounds, you're placing people in the United Kingdom and in Europe, but in North America, you're absolutely right.
Well, Sue, you look at Michigan. All the years before you were there, we turned out people all the time from Africa and got them all. They all got jobs without any difficulty. It wasn't necessarily impossible because people could see the mainstream of it at the time, and I think it's actually refreshing to see a new generation of people coming in this way, because there's also a chance. I mean, I came in actually history, not classics, and I think coming in anthropology or history also works. So I'm not entirely convinced. I think it's actually refreshing to see a generation of young scholars in North Africa.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, for the
I
market,
couldn't agree.
I think in the market it'll work too. I mean, I'm not convinced that.
Forgive me, it's a time of recommendation letter writing. For God's sake, give a job! Okay, Jonathan's through history too. David.
I think there's another side of working in Africa and what it brings to careers, and that is that, because of the state of the field, it's actually a place where you can make a difference.
Yeah.
And you can make a difference in quite a spectacular way. I mean, when we work in Firman, we get up every day, go out in the field, and I know that someone's going to come back and will have discovered something completely new every day. Yeah. And often it's several people who come back and have found something new about the Garamantes. Now, I don't think there's many other parts of the ancient world where one has that sort of exploratory hit rate of new data. When I worked in Jordan for a few years on the Wadi Firman project, there were 8 international teams operating in the same small valley. In the Central Sahara, I'm one team, and there's a group of Italians about 400 kilometers away, and that's it. In a huge zone of the Central Sahara, it's
whole different density level. Well, and I was also thinking what Will said about the work that the teams are doing in Libya. In some ways, built a bridge to what can happen now, and so it's differences.
Again, there will be data quality issues and things like this, but again, the hope is that there will somehow be a broader pool of colleagues where, again, you just have such vastness, and again, a time of tremendous change, unprecedented change. So while Department of Antiquities members might, because their job is literally to identify these places and protect them, they'll have a certain, that is what they're getting paid for, at least. A number of them have a number of other interests, personal interests and scholastic interests, but on the outside, as collaborators, the hope is that, part of what you can help bring to that is, in addition with wonderful Libyan colleagues like Ahmed Bouzian, for instance, a chance to ask questions with the broader data pool, provided that relationship remains intact with the governmental authority. And that's never easy. There's nothing that guarantees that, and certainly in the context of Egypt, for instance, it's so far beyond us now to ever hope to sort of regain that sense of. I'm afraid that the last 200 years of Egyptology, for instance, we have spent a lot of the capital and goodwill that we ever had, and it's going to be a long time before we can bring that back. There are other contexts in North Africa where the relationship is still healthy.
Yeah, just on this question of the general question of what is North African archaeology adding to maybe the study of the classical world, the study to whatever. I mean, just in terms of the kind of job market and things like that. So, I mean, this speaking from a very navel-gazing point of view, at Reed College may be one of the few places left in the world that requires all students to take a course in classical civilization. I mean, in fact, it is the only course all students take together, and it's the only course you basically take your first year. It is continually. I mean, the reason why probably this doesn't exist anymore is most places probably in the United States since the 1970s have been thinking that teaching the Western canon, called Western canon, is probably not the only way we should be doing education. You should be offer broader, diverse ways. And Reed kind of held this. At least they saw. If you're going to teach something, if you want every student to take at least something in common, why not this? Now, but the way that they increasingly the pressures of kind of issues around diversity, issues around the kind of post-colonial critique, have been strong. And the way in which they've done it is actually to take the course and actually make it much more about the encounter. It's about the classical, the Greek and the Roman encounter with the Persians, with the Egyptians, with the So basically now, almost 50% of the material, over 50% of the material is on the eastern or southern Mediterranean, and a good probably a third of it takes place in literally geographical North Africa. Now nobody is actually trained at Reed to teach this stuff, right? So they're all kind of making it up, right? They're all kind of training themselves.
You need people that are trained to teach that. Right?
They never stopped anybody in academia.
But basically, they're all reading basically the work of people in this room, right? And all kind of learning how to do this. But my guess is that every future kind of hire at least in the classics department, is going to be looking in that way. And I'm guessing Reed isn't the only place where this kind of that this provides a way to exactly get at the questions I think that Dave and Corey and a lot of us are asking, which is about the intersections, about how what are these moments of encounter and what do they look like, and how to kind of tell a more complex story.
What I'd also add is that although North Africa has often been a sort of forgotten footnote in sort of wider debate, North Africanists are not that insular. Every single person I think in this room who's presented today who works in the field, not only have they often worked in multiple North African countries, we're all comparative by nature, but I think everyone has excavated and published on projects in other countries, in other time periods, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or Jordan or Italy or wherever. Everyone here does not only work on North Africa, so we are engaged with these wider things, whether people like it or not. It's just nice if people read a little bit more of North African stuff.
All right. Who haven't we heard from? Basically, quite. Oh dear. Here we go.
Well, one thing we haven't heard from is a prehistorian. I think I'm the only prehistorian in the room, I think. Susan Allen left. So Sue, you said, we've had all kinds of bits and pieces thrown into the pot and then let's stir it up and get a nice North African stew, but no prehistoric pieces whatsoever were tossed into this conversational pot. And I think it's extraordinary, really, that a day of conversation about the archaeology of North Africa, trying to encapsulate it and get something of a snapshot, albeit a very North American focused and Anglophone and so on, as Andrew was saying, should entirely omit the entirety of the prehistory of this vast area. I mean, it's an area of about 2 million square miles we're talking about. And the closest we got to prehistory, I suppose, was around San Martin. Took us back to the 10th and the 11th, maybe the 12th, but the second millennium is completely a blank. Lisa, excoriated the Capsian culture as the most boring prehistoric culture anywhere in the Mediterranean. That's all we heard about that. The truth is that there are extremely important prehistoric sites in this part of the circum-Mediterranean. It's actually in Algeria, northeast Algeria, at Ain Hanek, that there's the oldest site in the entirety of the Mediterranean. It's 1.8 million years. It's older one. Pebble chopper tool assemblage. There's really important sites like Fateh, that offer a sort of Frankie Cave-like site for the south side of the Mediterranean. But generally, the prehistoric evidence across this vast area is extraordinarily thin on the ground, and I don't know why that is. Those who have...
Bruce apparently knows.
It is the one part of archaeology in North Africa that has always been ghettoized and has never been part of any national agenda, whether contemporary, French, or otherwise. It has always been, this was never part, it was seen as not part of anybody's, national issue of identity, or, whether colonial, more recent, and it still remains highly, highly ghettoized. It's the one that's given the least funding. It's always been the one that has given the least attention. There's never been an appropriation of prehistory at any point on a level that compares with, say, for example, the interest in prehistory in North America, the interest in prehistory in Europe, and things like that. Where, you look at France. France hasn't even appropriated the idea of prehistory as part of its national identity, so it gets put into a different category.
So why is it the case that across all these 4 countries that we've been talking about all day, there is so little prehistory? But if you go just a little bit further east into Egypt, there is not only an extraordinarily rich late prehistory on which a lot of work is being done, but there's a really robust understanding of the Paleolithic archaeology of Egypt. It's one of the best places in the world, actually, to work on that area. So why should it be so different?
There were always 3 or 4 prehistorians who worked in North Africa, French prehistorians, and they had groups of students, but they always came at it by being the Berber archaeologists, the Gabriel Comps and their school. And so, in other words, you could do prehistory, but it was embedded within the experience of so-called Berber history. And it was an offshoot of that.
That frozenness.
Yeah.
David, you want to comment on this?
I've actually just been about a month ago at a big French-based conference on North African history and archaeology, and that did span prehistory, Punic, Roman, Islamic, and a very wide range of papers, and there were quite a lot of Maghrebians now working on prehistoric sites, and I thought that was a really interesting development. One of the best papers, in fact, one of the most surprisingly best papers, was someone who talked in minute detail about the 16 different ways to get the snail out of their shells in the capsule. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So again, there are some signs.
Escargot forks or what? 16 different ways.
But in the last year,
please go ahead.
In the last year, actually, there's been a couple really good publications, like incredibly recently by an Algerian scholar named Sahnouni, who's been revisiting a lot of the Algerian, because there actually is some very nice stratigraphic deposits in the sites you mentioned that he's gone back and been able to rectify those dates a little bit more. But it actually is very recent.
Yeah, the prehistoric material in the wadis, there's just a massive amounts of material if you really look for it.
I've got to say, though, in defense of my idea that the capsule is dull, that Cyprian Brubank does spend at least a couple pages discussing why it's so immobile,
right.
And comes up with the idea that the lack of harbors is key. I mean, it's not something that nobody's noticed.
Or just ears.
I think David has been characteristically modest because he omitted to mention that his own project has actually done an awful lot of stuff on prehistory, and with him, Martin Lahr and Rob Foley have been looking at everything from the Paleolithic onwards. Their work and Nick Drake's work as part of David's team have fed into new debates on routes across the Sahara and routes between Central Africa and the Mediterranean. I know my colleague Nick Barton is working in a cave in Morocco. There is exciting work going on. It just wasn't much on today's agenda.
Yeah, I think that's the term. I offered you the chance to pitch in, John, but you didn't.
I mean, one of the most striking things, I've heard during this conference is Andy's pointing out to us that the area we're talking about today is 2.5 times bigger than the areas covered by the last 4 state-of-the-field conferences together. So if you use that as the sort of basis of comparison and think about how much prehistory we have from North Africa to fit into this area 2.5 times bigger than all the rest, it's extraordinarily small. I mean, of course, there are these individual points of light and individual projects, some of which I know about and some of which I don't. But I mean, I think, since Lisa mentioned Cyprian Broodbank, those who have engaged with his Making of the Middle Sea book, and he's grinning, I know he knows what to tell me. Cyprian has a wonderful passage where he imagines Fernand Braudel in a sort of seaplane of the late 1920s or early 1930s, sort of cruising across the entirety of the Mediterranean, looking out of the window and seeing what's going on. And eventually he comes over North Africa and the Maghreb, and there's just a bank of fog obscuring everything. And Andy visualized this in a wonderful PowerPoint slide in the graduate seminar that he took with me a couple of years ago. But that's my point. I mean, it's
Well, that's enough time on prehistoric crap. Yeah, so.
Sort of follow up on that. This thing we talked about earlier wasn't here for all the companies. We have so much tied this to the Mediterranean and the Roman world. How about the African world?
Yeah.
Are there connections that, whether it's trade routes or is there real connection through archaeology and history going south here? And is that something that, or is it just all desert we sort of don't go there?
Well, you missed it there. David or Tom or yeah.
Well, again, I think that there's a huge amount of work to be done, but I think we've now worked out how to ways of going about that, which get around the problems of most of the objects that moved between the Mediterranean and the sub-Saharan zone and in the reverse direction are not visible archaeologically are not quantifiable archaeologically when they are occasionally visible.
I wanted to ask you actually about the last glacial optimum in Sahara. There's this sort of idea that I've come across that there must have been a great deal in the Sahara of the prehistoric remains, which then, because of the intense desiccation, have been lost.
It's kind of all there if you go and look for it. I mean, the sort of the pastoral lakeside encampments are extraordinarily well preserved if they haven't been driven over by 16 four-wheel drive vehicles. And we've done a certain amount of recording of those sorts of sites, and it's pretty amazing material. But that's another whole other sort of project. The Italian team, led by Sabina Deloni, has done some very good work on those.
And you've been quiet. Uncharacteristically so.
Is that a question?
I'm just noting we're clocking down, so I just want to make sure that people are not being shy anymore. They're past shy.
I'm not being shy.
Okay, it's not being shy. I knew you weren't shy. All right. So, what then should we do? What then can we do? How's that? I want to just ask one more question about legacy, just to not necessarily now, and that is the question of how do you know how does one discover what data sets are for revisitation and re-examination? That's one thing. The other is who is this broader community, and how do you link up people who are not like that whole gang over there, not going to work in North Africa, but would benefit with knowing junior colleagues who do. So I guess again the sense of communications and networking of scholars. That's something I'm thinking about right now.
I think a major need is to actually mobilise some of the archives that are out there, particularly from the colonial era. Aix-en-Provence has enormous photographic archives and paper archives relating to French archaeology, map making in the Maghreb. And there's a big debate because the Maghrebian countries keep saying, can we have the archives back? And they they don't want to give them back, but they don't want to invest in doing anything with it either. You know, that expensive business of digitizing the material and indexing it and sorting it. But that's actually a real priority. And you know, now that we have the ability to produce large digital archives, you know, I think that there's a real need that we do that with some of these big archives before that material kind of falls apart or you know, gets sent back piecemeal and dispersed.
That's certainly possible now, and I think costs are indeed dropping too. So.
Yeah, and the problem they have is that there's no commitment nationally to build what we used to call the keep africain in X and other places. That when posts come up in X and other places, there are and X is actually competing with Bordeaux and places like that. They don't have the positions. They used to have a massive team of people. Of course, you know, they were Pieds-Noirs, etc. in many cases. But they don't have, if you go there now, there are just a handful of Africans at best. And they have all the resources, but they can't get positions.
Well, that sounds familiar in lots of ways. Other desiderata. Apart from wine and cheese.
Sue, do you want to bring up or invite any comments about the general sort of security situation of doing work in these lands? I mean, another thing that struck me, having been at now all 5 of these State of the Field conferences, is, you know, and broadly speaking, obviously there are localized exceptions, but broadly speaking, across, you know, Turkey, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, there's no real impediments in terms of, you know, insurgencies or you know, military engagements, other problems of that sort, and of course from, you know, now in our present situation, from southeast Turkey going all the way around the Mediterranean, all the way to the Atlantic, there are you know, issues, and I'm not getting a clear sense from hearing from or talking to individuals who are present at this meeting about how bad they think things are, or you know, whether things are getting better and they're generally optimistic, whether work is no longer possible. I mean, is there any sense of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, the sort of situation is in flux across the whole region. We're currently working at Utica, and northern Tunisia is fine, but in terms of taking the team around on a field trip, we start at the coastal region. There's a region of Kasserine and Spitler where Bruce worked back in the 1980s. It was basically a no-go. Libya, you can't take a foreign team in and do field work there. I would be surprised if my university would give me insurance to take a team to do field work in most of Algeria. Morocco, you can. So, I mean, this for the nationals of those countries in the archaeological service, in a sense they've got no choice. That's their country and they're going to work there to the extent they can. But it's going to be a big disincentive for foreign teams to start working in some of the regions. And I can see that, going back to Sue's earlier question about will this get people jobs, you know, this is going to be a disincentive for students looking for dissertation topics to work on that region. When I did my dissertation on rail and water management in North Africa, I took this sort of unfeasibly large regional view from Morocco through to Cyrenaica, partly thinking that at that time I couldn't get into Algeria and what if one of the other countries started to become problematic. At least I did insure myself by spreading risk. I didn't dream that the entire region would become as difficult as it now has.
I could pick up on that just for a second. The interesting thing about it is that I could not go back, and no one could go back and work in the Kasserine region now because the Al-Qaeda and the Maghreb is in Jebel Chandi. It's been interesting because this region, from the point of view of long-term history, you know, this was the center of resistance to the French in 1956. This is where the Fedayeen in the mountains lived. They lived in this region. This region, you know, has always, you know, under Bourguiba, there were a number of people shot. There was a massacre in the stadium in Kasserine. Bourguiba rounded up a whole bunch of people and shot them. The young people, the person who rented our house to us told me And when I was incarcerated, he said he wanted to send his son to the United States to study. He said he would never send him to Tunis. He would send them to two places. He would send them to Damascus or to Algeria. But Tunis was off limits. And that what we're revealing about these regions is that these regions have always been disconnected from the dorsal in ways that need to be understood for a variety of reasons. And in some ways, it's sort of, you can't be totally surprised by what's happening in terms of that disengagement. And it goes to this whole issue of how does the nation state and identity in North Africa fit together? Not well. And this dynamic is now playing itself out in terms of how we engage with it. If I went down there, I mean, they thought, when I was there in the 1980s, they thought I was in the CIA. They thought I was in the CIA. And I said,
thought you were in the CIA.
There were two answers, yes, no.
Right, Will, do you have anything to say on this issue from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I think that the challenge that we see in a small way in Libya, but across the region, of course, we have very little ability to influence anything related to it. And we recently, in March, really got to the point in Libya where we have not been able to go back since then, even though up until that point we had been spending a lot of time on the ground. We're in a frustrating position here in America in particular because we lost our ambassador, and that is a very emotional issue. Our embassy that is pulled out to Malta, we don't know when they'll go back, and for us as people where, again, I mean, our colleagues in Tripoli, they've actually been telling me to come to Tripoli, come back, things are fine, life is good, plenty of water, lots of electricity, internet works, we got work to do. Up until March, we gave them more or less the ultimate say. Thumbs up, thumbs down, should we go, where should we go? Just because that, and again, I mean, somewhat of the peculiarities of how we, involved in the cultural sphere, interact with the American embassy apparatus, even though we were receiving funding from the State Department, we did not have any access to special advice or treatment or any kind of knowledge, special knowledge that could have told us where they thought we should go. And they're generally, acting with tremendous prudence, they tended not to go anywhere, and we're glad to think that there were some American collaborators or grantees who were still willing to stay involved. And right now, for us, because we don't feel that there's been a strong signal that it makes sense to go back to Libya and continue on the ground, and frankly, because it's very hard right now at a time where the Supreme Court has invalidated the elections, and where even whatever body the international community thought that it was talking to has at least internally through the judicial system been invalidated, even though they continue to sort of exist. That's a very hard partnership with the federal government, and yet strangely enough, our colleagues in the department continue to be paid by the central bank, and as long as that's the most critical thing right now. But that's still not enough normality to permit us to go back. And we don't know what that thumbs up signal will look like, what the green light will really look like. And so for the time being, we are actively seeking alternatives because at the same time, there's still momentum. There still actually is work going on in the field. There still actually is a desire to continue to collaborate, and there's still enough freedom of movement to imagine that can happen.
So after the remote, lightweight,
or lateral. We just have to think
inventive, lateral,
for the time being, because
and persistent. Yeah.
Working with Africa requires some persistence.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Well, exactly. At the moment, we don't know what's going to happen. It's pretty bleak in a political situation in various parts. But it's also been like that before. When you did your PhD, you couldn't go to Algeria. No one would have imagined you could go around Algeria. In 2010, I drove around Algeria for 2 months. Now you can't, again, but the situation is constantly fluctuating. When we left Libya, when we left Gaddafi, we thought we'd be back the next week, but we weren't.
It's also uncertain, but that doesn't mean we can't try and do things. It doesn't mean we can't think laterally and think about ways to get around issues. It doesn't mean we should write it off.
I think that's a great final word myself, unless I want to thank this gang. They did enormous amounts of work. I think this has been an enormous success. I couldn't agree more. It's tough, it's challenging, but I'm on board. So, speakers, I thank you all again, and please everyone join us for the reception and.